Good afternoon. And the first item of business today is questions to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. Question 1, John Wilson.
Presiding Officer, Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, what action it is taken in light of the findings of the Audit Scotland's report managing early departures from the Scottish public sector?
Ms Scanlon.
Scottish Parliament Corporate Body has already exemplified the principles of good practice identified in the Audit Scotland report when it ran its early severance and retirement scheme in 2010-11. This scheme achieved a reduction of 37 posts and fully paid for itself within 2 years, with ongoing reductions in the staff pay budget. The results were fully disclosed in the annual accounts.
Thank you. John Wilson.
I thank Mary Scanlon for that response, Deputy Presiding Officer. And the full answer in terms of 37 posts that have been disappeared from the corporate body's make-up. But could I ask the corporate body whether or not there was confidentiality agreements signed as part of these settlements?
Ms Scanlon.
I cannot be precise about the exact settlements between 2010-11, but I can tell John Wilson that the corporate body has used compromise agreements. They are indeed a useful means of protecting the organisation from legal challenges relating to departures, but are only used in exceptional circumstances.
Many thanks. Question 2, Alex Johnstone.
To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body whether the external security facility will be delivered on time and on budget.
Ian MacArthur.
Thank you. I can confirm the project is on track to be delivered on time and within budget. I think it may be helpful to reflect that the decision to proceed with the project was not taken lightly and was based on the SPCB's corporate and legal responsibilities to ensure safety of over 400,000 visitors annually and up to 1,000 daily pass holders, including staff, MSPs, media and contractors.
Thank you. Alex Johnstone.
Can I express my delight that, contrary to the main part of the building, this one will be established on time and on budget. But can I further ask if the member will confirm that the project will be completed and the building will be back to its full and normal usage in time for the Festival of Politics in late August this year?
Liam MacArthur.
I can certainly understand that Alex Johnstone bears the scars of that earlier experience, but I hope he will draw some reassurance from the fact that the security facility is scheduled to become operational by August this year. The project as a whole, including closing off the existing entrance, is due to be finished by the end of the summer, but it will be operational in time for the Festival of Politics.
Thank you. Question 3, Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body what steps they have taken to ensure that those with sensory impairments can take a full and active part when visiting the Parliament or indeed external engagements that are organised via the Parliament.
Scanlon.
I thank the member for his question. The Scottish Parliament Corporate Body has undertaken a number of steps to ensure that all visitors can fully and actively take part in any meeting or external event of the Parliament. For example, induction loops and infrared systems are available in both the chamber and committee rooms, and we have TV screens throughout the building to enable viewing of business. Additional provision has been put in place to reflect the needs of people with sensory impairments. For example, we have information leaflets for witnesses and other visitors in a range of formats, including audio and BSL, and we also have a contract for BSL and other communication support to enable us to access provisions such as note takers, palantypists and BSL interpreters as and when requested.
Thank you. Dennis Robertson.
Can I thank Mary Scanlon for that very precise answer? The corporate body is probably aware that in some cases that those with sensory impairments and those maybe who are profoundly deaf relying on BSL are not or cannot take full part within the Parliament when visiting, and our television screens don't have appropriate text to witness what's going on in particular and doesn't have BSL. I wonder if the corporate body would consider looking at other means or improving the facilities for our BSL users in the future.
Ms Scanlon.
I thank Dennis Robertson for that. I am aware through officials that there was one particular instance during a recent visit to Stornoway where members of the public would drop in to meet the members of the committee before a formal meeting, and we were unaware of some of the members of the public's needs on that occasion. But when bookings are made in the Parliament, we always ask if any level of support is required, and when we reviewed our provision for BSL and other forms of communication support, it was decided to automatically provide an interpreter where there is a debate and a meeting in relation to deaf issues. However, anyone can request a BSL interpreter or any other form of communication support for any meeting of the Parliament, and we will look to meet any request provided sufficient notice is given.
Thanks. Question 4, Christine Grahame.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body whether it will consider procuring a resident cat as a humane mouse deterrent.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No, the Parliamentary Corporate Body has no plans to procure a resident cat. We do, however, have a specialist pest control contractor who visits the building regularly.
Well, can I say to the member that I am dispirited by the response, as we have already an established practice of setting nature on unwanted residents in the form of the hawk versus the pigeons, and given that this was prompted by the experience of a member of the corporate body who shall remain nameless. Is the corporate body really satisfied that the mice are under control, given the increased and increasing sightings as they flaunt themselves in public in broad daylight? And will the corporate body reconsider if there are more rodent rompings and provide some rather homeless felines with meaningful employment?
Linda Fabiani.
Can I say to the member that she's not half as dispirited as these poor wee mice? With the panic in the breasties as they saw Mistresses Scanlon and Grahame advancing upon them in Queensberry House. We have looked at the suggestion of a Parliament cat, but there's lots of issues there. There's the issue of the security doors. There's the issue of cruelty, in fact, to a resident cat who wouldn't be able to go about the building. We have had members who have said to us that they have an allergy to cats, for example. And yes, we are satisfied that the pest control measures that we currently take are sufficient to stop the infestation of mice that Mrs Grahame is obviously terribly concerned about.
Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think my colleague Christine Grahame is to be congratulated for her question, which has set the cat among the pigeons. Pest control is a serious issue, and not to address it would be a mistake and could even have catastrophic consequences for health and safety for those who work in the building. And I think if we could investigate the issue of a security collar for the cat, that might overcome some of the problems which Linda Fabiani has identified.
Linda Fabiani.
May I say that we don't have problems in making sure that we are in control of any potential mouse sightings in this Parliament, and that therefore the answer to Mr Eadie is no.
Thank you. Edifying. Question 5, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what work is being carried out on the wooden spars on the Parliament building, or shutters if you want to call them that, and at what cost and in what timescale.
Linda Fabiani.
No work is currently being carried out on the timber louvres. It's louvres rather than shutters, Mr Lyle. Yes, I'm afraid I gave you the wrong advice earlier. However, maintenance work is planned to take place during the summer recess. That will include the removal and maintenance of the timber louvers on the MSP and Canongate buildings. The cost of that will be approximately £25,000, and there will be in-situ recoating of what we call the bamboo poles that are actually oak veneer at the public entrance canopy, and that will cost approximately £2,000. It's an ongoing requirement that is budgeted for in the long-term maintenance plan to maintain the external timber on the building, and the timber, of course, being part of the palette of materials used in the overall Parliament complex.
Richard Lyle.
Yeah, can I thank Linda Fabiani for the louvres. As you actually stand in Committee Room 2, looking towards the windows in Committee Room 6, the spars or shutters or louvres outside are in a very bad state of repair, and I would suggest the member go up and have a look. And they're very weather-beaten. The windows also require attention. What steps would you now take to ensure that the louvres are fixed?
Linda Fabiani.
I am tempted to ask Monsieur Allard to intervene and tell us the correct pronunciation of Louvre. But Richard Lyle puts forward a very serious point, and something I feel very strongly about is that we have an absolutely wonderful parliamentary complex here. And one of the things that is often commented upon by visitors and professionals in the related fields of construction is the quality of the finishes, the quality of the palette that we have used. And part of that has to be ongoing maintenance with a zero-tolerance policy towards not only defects but towards ongoing maintenance, so that we don't let things start to look shabby. I'm certainly a wee bit concerned about what Mr Lyle has said, about his concern about the shabbiness of some of these Louvre and indeed the window. And I will have a look, and I'll make sure that the very, very professional maintenance team and procurement team that we have here in the Parliament have a look at that as well, and consider our maintenance ongoing and cyclical to ensure that we never allow our parliamentary complex in any way to look less than at its best. Thank you.
Thank you. Question 6, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body what reductions in energy usage have been achieved across the campus over the last 3 years.
Linda Fabiani.
And it seems to be me again, presiding officer. We have reduced the total energy used in the building by 12% over the last 3 years, and we're quite pleased by that. We've done this by reducing electricity consumption by 15%, gas by 7%, and that has delivered savings of around £200,000 per annum. We've reduced the Parliament's carbon footprint by 19% over the same period.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Can I very much welcome the progress that has been made over the past 3 years by the corporate body. I wonder if Ms Fabiani can tell us whether there is room to make further progress, and if so, what additional steps might be taken in the future to try and improve matters further.
Linda Fabiani.
Yeah, this is an ongoing process, because I think we all have a responsibility to be meeting the governance target that across this Parliament we've all agreed is right, and the Parliament as an institution has agreed with that as well. So we do have further plans. We've got an ambitious target to reduce the carbon emissions by 42% by 2020 compared to 2005 and 6 levels. Just yesterday, in fact, at our meeting, we approved a carbon management plan to try and ensure that we achieve this target, and we're currently on course to reach that. To do that, we'll reduce electricity consumption by 40% and gas by 14%. And of course, what's also important as technology moves on, we'll continue to invest in new equipment which delivers energy savings, where there's a good business case. And we had a really interesting discussion yesterday about LED lighting in that regard. So it's about improving control of equipment in the building and making the heating and the ventilation more responsive to requirements.
Thank you. Question 7, John Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what the average number of customers using the Queensberry House lounge is on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays before 4 p.m.
Linda Fabiani.
Can I say that although I'm in there a lot, I don't actually make a point of sitting at the door and taking these notes myself, Mr Lamont. And we do not record the number of customers who use the Queensberry House lounge on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays before 4 p.m. We do record the number of transactions that take place, but that doesn't tell us the number of people who actually use the lounge, because a single transaction can often involve multiple individuals. And of course, as I do myself, and as I know a lot of my colleagues do, members and their guests can use that Queensberry House lounge before 4 o'clock as a meeting area without actually purchasing any refreshments.
Mr Lamont.
I'll thank the member for that answer. I'm very disappointed that she's not counting the customers as they arrive and leave. However, my conversations with the staff in the lounge suggest that some days there's only 4 or 5 transactions taking place each day before 4 p.m. And I wonder if the corporate body accepts this figure and whether they might consider lifting the restrictions on who can access the lounge before 4 p.m.
Fabiani.
Well, first of all, would I say that of course we accept it. If that's what our staff tell us is the situation, of course we accept that. But I would repeat what I've said already, which is that there are members who use it as a meeting place, a private meeting place, without actually making any purchases. I have seen members, in fact, buy coffee at the coffee bar outside and wander in to the Queensberry House space. The corporate body felt it was very, very important that members of this Parliament have somewhere that they can take people to have a meeting that is private. And we felt that the best way of achieving that, to the benefit of all, was to make it before 4 o'clock. It would be for members and invited guests only, in order that there could be a degree of confidentiality for meetings with constituents, for example, who come to visit us at the Parliament. And that is not something that the corporate body has again considered, because we feel it's a very important principle.
Many thanks, and that concludes questions to the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. And we'll now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6798 in the name of Paul Wheelhouse on the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill. And I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press their request to speak buttons now, to introduce their cards as soon as possible, to allow them to speak. And Minister Paul Wheelhouse, when you are ready, I would invite you to speak for a generous 13 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a well-known fact that crofting tenure forms an important part of our environmental, cultural and social heritage, and that crofting traditions are close to the hearts of so many. As a consequence of these factors, the topic of crofting often inspires emotion and debate, and the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill 2013 is no exception, even though there is general agreement about the purpose of the bill. Those involved in crofting will know that the Crofters Scotland Act 1993 has already been amended by the Crofting Reform Acts of 2007 and 2010. We are now seeking to amend it further by the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill, but for very good reason. I'm sure that those involved with the introduction of the 2010 Act did not imagine for one moment that we would be here today addressing an unintended consequence from that Act. But crofting legislation is renowned for its complexities, and as Minister with responsibility for crofting, I can certainly vouch for that. The issue, as many members know, is in the provisions allowing crofters to apply to decroft land. The Act was intended to allow decrofting by both tenant and owner-occupier crofters. But legal advice received by the Crofting Commission said that, in fact, the Act does not provide for decrofting by owner-occupier crofters. Therefore, on the 25th of February this year, the Commission announced that it could not accept any further decrofting applications from owner-occupier crofters. When the flaw in the legislation was identified, there was widespread support to solve the problem and to solve it quickly. The Scottish Government listened to the concerns raised. It then took swift action to bring forward this bill to ensure, firstly, that owner-occupier crofters can once again apply to the Crofting Commission to decroft their land, and secondly, that the direct impact of those affected was addressed as quickly as possible. As I indicated to this Parliament on 28th of March this year, there are known examples of people being negatively affected by the flaw in the legislation. Some are unable to start building their houses until the land is decrofted, and deadlines for completion are approaching because of time-limited planning consent. Others are unable to decroft to increase the size of their house site to provide sufficient garden ground. A young crofter is unable to proceed with acquiring part of an owner-occupier crofter's croft because of the uncertainty of being able to decroft part of his new croft to build a house. And a young crofting couple who are planning to start a family are unable to decroft a house site to sell in order to finance a larger house while remaining in the original croft. These are just a few examples of real people being directly affected by this decrofting issue. This bill, once enacted, will provide a solution for these people and many more in similar circumstances. That solution is required urgently to ensure that owner-occupier crofters are given similar rights and are treated in a similar way to tenant crofters and landlords. Before I go into the detail of the bill, I welcome the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee's Stage 1 report, which was published on Friday 31st of May. I congratulate the committee on its thorough consideration of all the issues raised. Bringing forward legislation quickly does not mean that parliamentary scrutiny should be compromised. In fact, I place enormous importance in both stakeholder engagement and parliamentary scrutiny. For this reason, I will in a moment cover the main issues raised in the Stage 1 report. The Scottish Government has taken time to carefully consider the best way forward. It has produced a bill that meets the key aim of allowing owner-occupier crofters to apply to the Crofting Commission to decroft. This attracted widespread support during Stage 1. The original intention in the 2010 Act was to align decrofting by owner-occupier crofters with decrofting by landlords, which comes under the vacant croft provisions in Section 23 of the 1993 Act. However, that intention does not work because of Section 23(10) of the 1993 Act, which provides that if a croft is occupied by an owner-occupier crofter, it isn't vacant. So the existing legislation does not work as intended. This bill therefore removes decrofting by owner-occupier crofters from vacant croft provisions and inserts new standalone sections 24A to 24D into the 1993 Act. Some people have suggested retaining the link between owner-occupier decrofting and the vacant croft provisions, even when the croft is not vacant. But in the Scottish Government's opinion, the new provisions we propose will provide a greater degree of clarity and legal certainty. The bill sets out what the Crofting Commission can do when it receives an application to decroft. It can, of course, grant or refuse the decrofting application. However, if the Crofting Commission is already taking action against the applicant for a breach of crofting duty, the bill provides for the Commission not to consider the decrofting application in the meantime. This mirrors the equivalent rules for landlords of vacant crofts. Section 25 of the 1993 Act sets out the matters the Commission must take into account when determining a decrofting application. This bill applies most of Section 25 to owner-occupier crofters in as similar as possible a way as it applies to tenant crofters and landlords. However, the bill purposely leaves out the parts of Section 25 that relate only to tenants, such as the provisions relating to a crofter's right to buy. The bill also extends to owner-occupier crofters the existing right of a tenant crofter to decroft the site of a dwelling house, where they have not already decrofted a house site. There was, of course, a question of what to do with the 159 decrofting directions already issued by the Commission, and I can update the Parliament the 44 applications currently held in abeyance. The observant amongst you will have noticed that these figures have changed slightly from the earlier announcement in Parliament on 28th of March. The figures have reduced from 50 outstanding applications to 44 outstanding applications as a result of checks undertaken by the Crofting Commission. These checks, at our request, verified that 6 of the outstanding applications did not in actual fact relate to owner-occupier crofters. Now, turning to retrospection, in the bill, the Scottish Government has proposed retrospective provisions to allow the legislation to apply to cases from 1st of October 2011, when the definition of owner-occupier crofter was introduced. This will place those involved in the 159 cases where they expected to be, and where Parliament crucially intended them to be. And it will allow the 44 outstanding applications to be fully processed as soon as the legislation comes into force. The bill also makes consequential modifications to the 1993 and 2010 Acts as a result of the new sections 24A to 24D, mainly adding cross-references to the new provisions. These consequential modifications will ensure that the new provisions work as intended alongside existing legislation, which is an important safeguard. I certainly will.
To the Minister for taking intervention. Doesn't all this prove that, as the Rural Affairs Committee have suggested, there's a desperate need for a consolidation of all crofting legislation into one Act?
Minister.
Well, I certainly recognise, and I'll deal with it later in the speech, but I certainly do recognise the member's point that the committee have raised a very fair issue that the crofting law is horrendously complex. It's in some ways impenetrable from the uninitiated eye, and there clearly is a case for looking at some of the existing problems we do know that do exist. I hope that set out today the rationale for keeping this particular bill tightly defined to ensure that we get a quick solution for the benefit of constituents in Mr Scott's constituency and others. As I say, the consequential modifications will ensure that new provisions work as intended, and they also ensure that the crofting register provisions in the 2010 Act will apply to decrofting by owner-occupier crofters who submit applications in the same way as they apply to other decrofting applications. The consequential and retrospective provisions were largely welcomed during Stage 1, and I welcome the committee's support for these issues in its Stage 1 report. Lastly, there was a suggestion that some people might have intended to appeal against a decrofting decision, but decided not to do so as a result of the Decrofting Commission's announcement in February. We have therefore included a right of appeal for applications determined within 42 days before the Commission's announcement, which is in line with the normal appeal arrangements. Again, I note that the committee welcomes and supports these provisions in its report. Turning now to some of the concerns that were raised during Stage 1. One concern expressed was that passing the right to decroft the site of a dwelling house from one owner-occupier crofter to another might lead to speculative development. In fact, this is already the position with tenant crofters, and it does not appear to have created any issues. However, this can be considered further if it becomes a problem in relation to owner-occupier crofters. Turning to another concern, some have criticised the fundamental drafting of the bill. It is only natural there will be differences of opinion on this. Given the range of views expressed in evidence, I have some sympathy with the committee's position that it is difficult to give a definitive view on the validity of some of the drafting concerns raised. As I indicated to the committee on 22nd of May, there is more than one way to draft a bill, and length is not the only consideration. I certainly will.
I'm grateful to the Minister. Would he accept that, as several of those concerns about drafting were raised by lawyers who are eminent in the field of crofting law, and I have to say I admire them in being so, would he accept that there are serious issues here and that his government will look at seriously before Stage 2 amendments take place?
Minister? I'm just coming on to that point. I hope if I don't address it, I will let Mr Ferguson come back in after that. Some stakeholders have indeed suggested alternative drafting, which would be shorter and which might, perhaps, deliver the policy intention. But with the greatest respect to those very eminent lawyers that Mr Ferguson refers to, these points, in my opinion, perhaps isn't good enough. We have to be clear. This bill is addressing a flaw in the legislation. That being the case, we have to be sure that what we do will address the key issue, that is in respect of decrofting, to provide equality of treatment to owner-occupiers as is provided for tenants. That is why the Government's bill is drafted in the particular way it is. And our view that the bill will resolve this issue is supported by others. However, during the committee's stakeholder evidence session, Sir Crispin Agnew said, and I quote, "I think the bill will solve the particular problem by making it clear that the Crofting Commission can decroft owner-occupier crofts." And during the same session, Derek Flynn of the Crofting Federation said that the legislation was needed and that the present bill appears to answer that need. We also heard that the Crofting Commission was of the view that the bill addresses and solves the problem. And there was also support from others, including Scottish Land and Estates and NFUS, who recognised the need for legislation to deal with the problem quickly. But I do recognise the point that Mr Ferguson makes, and it's perhaps something I'm sure the committee will come back to. Moving on to the issue of consultation, some questioned whether there was sufficient time for proper consideration of the bill. Presiding officer, in the circumstances we faced, the Scottish Government had to strike a balance between dealing with the issue urgently whilst carefully considering the options and ensuring key stakeholders had the opportunity to contribute. So our stakeholder consultation was very short indeed compared with normal procedures, but this was entirely due to the urgency of the issue. We heard during Stage 1 that the National Farmers Union of Scotland considered that it had, and I quote, ample opportunity to respond, and that consultation on the draft bill had, and again I quote, been fine. The Crofting Commission's view was that the consultation had worked, as the problem itself is very defined. I believe, therefore, that the right level of consultation was applied to this bill under the circumstances and given the tight focus of the bill. I note that the committee welcomed the Scottish Government's attempts to seek stakeholders' views once the problem had been identified and once the bill had been published. I also note the committee's view on public consultation in respect to any further changes to crofting law. In relation to those crofters whose individual cases are affected by the inability to decroft, I note the committee's recommendation that the Crofting Commission should process the outstanding applications as swiftly as possible. This should apply equally to any that have not been able to be submitted in the interim. And as I indicated to the committee on the 22nd of May, Section 6 provides for the legislation to be effective immediately following royal assent. This will enable the Commission to process the 44 outstanding applications and any newly submitted applications as early as possible. I recognise that a number of issues have also been raised which are out with the scope of this bill. I also recognise the need, as indicated by the committee in its Stage 1 report, to address these other issues in the future, and I can assure you that these issues will be addressed. I therefore give an undertaking that, subject to its parliamentary passage, once this bill has been enacted, my officials will investigate in consultation with stakeholders what the best method might be for dealing with outstanding issues. Depending on the outcome of these investigations, the Scottish Government will consider what further legislation may be required as we develop our future legislative programme. However, I would encourage members here today to focus on the issues relevant to this bill and work towards a mutually agreeable way forward. This will ensure that owner-occupier crofters can, once and for all, apply to decroft their land. And the scope of the bill is deliberately tightly focused on that owner-occupier crofter decrofting issue. Any deviation from that would fail to respect the expedited approach agreed for this bill. I will leave further scrutiny of the bill, as always, to the Scottish Parliament. I have no doubt that the committee and this Parliament as a whole will continue to apply the high standard of scrutiny of legislation we are accustomed to, irrespective of the tight timescales applying to this bill. I am grateful to all those who have contributed to bringing us this far. This includes stakeholders who assisted in the early stages by providing information and those who have given evidence to the committee, and not least the committee itself and its clerks. And I would like to thank my own officials for their hard work. I look forward to continuing to work with all parties in the remaining stages of this bill, and I hope the committee will be assured by my confirmation that appropriate consideration is being given to all views expressed on the bill in advance of Stage 2 next week. And that includes, of course, the committee's Stage 1 report. In summary, Presiding Officer, the principles of the bill will deliver its intended purpose. I commend the bill and the committee's report to the Parliament. I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Rob Gibson to speak on behalf of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Mr Gibson, 9 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Speaking on behalf of the committee, I have to comment, of course, that crofts, as they say, are small pieces of land surrounded by thick, prickly hedges of legislation. That has never seemed more appropriate than in scrutinising this bill introduced by the Scottish Government under an expedited process to correct an anomaly that was uncovered in the 2010 Act, which itself amended the 1993 Crofting Act. The 2010 Act intended to put the newly created category of owner-occupier crofters on an equal footing to tenant crofters and landlords, and has a consequence to allow them to apply to the Crofting Commission to decroft their land. The date the relevant provisions of the 2010 Act were brought into force was October 2011, and the Crofting Commission began accepting and processing decrofting applications from owner-occupier crofters. All was well, or so it appeared. But some 159 applications had been considered when it was identified that there was, in fact, no provision in law for such decrofting application to be considered. And following legal advice, the Commission suspended consideration of applications from owner-occupier crofters until the situation was resolved. We now know 44 applications have also been made and not decided upon when that happened. Therefore, those 44 are more crofters currently waiting on decisions that will allow them to use their land for suitable purposes. The suspension of the applications took place back in February, so more owner-occupier crofters may be waiting for this to be resolved so that they can bring forward applications themselves. The law must reflect... certainly, yes.
Mr Paul Wheelhouse.
To help, given the expedited process, just to clarify, we understand there are 31 additional applications which have been processed but returned to the applicants, just to inform the member of the numbers involved.
That's very useful to know. Thank you very much. Presiding Officer, the law must reflect the policy intention of the 2010 Act that all crofters can decroft land, subject, of course, to safeguards that the Act introduced to protect croft land and to ensure the sustainability of crofting and stop speculation. Most evidence we received agreed that this was a problem that was needed to be addressed. Admittedly, there was some disagreement about whether the current legislation could be read as already permitting such decrofting applications. However, most agreed that a bill was the best way to settle this issue beyond doubt. We did have some regret over a very short time for the written views to be sent to the committee. We received a significant number of responses in the week or so that this was available. For this reason, we strongly recommended that the Government carefully considered all the evidence sent to the committee ahead of this debate today. All who gave evidence to us agreed that the bill, as drafted, would achieve its desired outcome. That is a key point to remember during this debate. Is there consensus that there is a problem? Yes. Is there consensus that this bill will fix that problem? Yes. The bill also ensures that its provisions will be applied retrospectively, as if it had been in force in October 2011, as was intended by the 2010 Act. In this instance, the committee is supportive of applying these provisions retrospectively. It will ensure that all owner-occupier crofters have been and will be treated fairly and appropriately. Presiding Officer, the bill also ensures that the appeal process available following a decrofting direction given by the Crofting Commission is applied fairly to those who have made applications but have yet to be given a decision. And I'm sure that during this debate we'll be hearing much of this discussed again and again, but I think it's important to realise that this is very important to quite a number of people, and that's why we're taking it so seriously. But more thickets and brambles awaited us. Lawyers who are expert in crofting law said that the bill is unnecessarily complex and that in places requires amendment so that we avoid further difficulties in legal interpretation in the future. We strongly urge the Government to consider these points carefully to determine if amendments are needed at stage 2 to ensure that the bill is clear and competent. Secondly, there were also additional issues raised about the definition of what makes an owner-occupier crofter rather than the owner-occupier of a croft, and how multiple owners of distinct parts of the same croft can proceed if all of them do not agree on one owner-occupier seeking to decroft their own piece of that land. These stem from the pre-devolution 1993 Crofting Act. Due to the expedited process, no resolution of these issues were examined, but they are listed in our Stage 1 report. The committee asked the Scottish Government... certainly, yes.
Very grateful for Mr Gibbons for giving way, and I can entirely agree with his latter conclusion about the issues that are still outstanding. Does he have any plans in his committee to have another look at those matters and bring some advice forward as to how we could deal with them?
Rob Gibson.
I think the committee is minded in its report to say that we should do. We might have to take 2 meetings a week in order to cover the complexity, and I wonder whether parliamentary authorities might allow us to do so. The committee asks the Scottish Government how it's going to address these issues and to inform us of how it intends to proceed. Would any changes to legislation be included in primary or secondary legislation using powers in the 2010 Act or using the Public Services Reform Act? We also recommend a clear time frame. Finally, we heard that crofting law today was, quotes, a mess and, quotes, a shambles, or as we Gaels would say, it was a bit of a boorach. There were calls for an urgent review of the law by the Scottish Government. Several crofting lawyers told the committee about difficulties in interpreting the law for their clients. Layer on layer of legislation has made crofting law, which can be overly complex and impenetrable, as the Minister mentioned. How can we expect crofters and other members of the public to understand this law? The Scottish Government must respond to these concerns. Some called for a consolidation of the law, but this was not address issues of simplification, comprehension and consistency. What may be required for the crofting law is codification, a restating of the policy but in revised and simplified terms, which will take time and we have to plan for. The committee calls on the Scottish Government to indicate how it intends to address these criticisms. Presiding Officer, the committee recommends the general principles of the bill are supported by Parliament today, but the committee heard that the current state of crofting legislation was a mess and a shambles. Therefore, it needs to be urgently reviewed, and those are the sentiments expressed to us. It is now up to all of us, the Scottish Government and the Parliament, to listen and to act. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Claudia Beamish, a generous 9 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour will be supporting the passage of the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill through Stage 1 today. Those of us who knew not a great deal about crofting, to be open about it, before this, unlike, I'm glad to say, many of the members on our committee. I've discovered that there are at present about 7,700 crofts in Scotland, mainly, of course, in the Highlands and Islands, and that around 33,000 people live in crofting households. The Scottish Government website reminds us that crofting plays a vital role in maintaining the population in remote rural areas. It provides a secure base for the development of small businesses and maintains and supports a range of unique habitats. In 2010, the Scottish Government issued a press release stating that the Scottish Government has passed the Government's Crofting Reform Scotland Bill, which aims to tackle absenteeism, neglect and speculation, and to protect crofting for future generations, which I found an interesting quote. Our committee is optimistic, in spite of the complexities involved, that the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill, if passed, will rectify the problem faced by those affected by the flaw in the 2010 Act in relation to owner-occupier crofter and the decrofting of land. I want to add my voice also to the comments made already by our convener, Rob Gibson, and indeed by the Minister about this bill in helping to take things forward. It is important that the bill goes through an expedited process in order to end the state of limbo which has been imposed, and the Minister highlighted many of the reasons why this was very important for those affected. However, this does mean that the challenge for the committee of analysing a complex range of legal views on possible amendments to the bill in evidence has been time truncated, and it was helpful for the Minister to outline a response to our report already, and I thank him for that because I'm sure the pressures are on him as well. I want to highlight two of the committee's recommendations because it's my belief that together they indicate the committee's agreed position clearly and tell the Chamber where we think we are in the determination to get it right for what happens next, especially in view of Rob Gibson's remarks about thickets and brambles. The committee, I quote, notes the criticism of the drafting of the bill, particularly by those who will be left to interpret and advise on the law. The committee is not expert in legal detail and the potential inconsistencies within crofting law, and it is therefore difficult for the committee to give a definitive view at this stage on the validity of some of the points, and I certainly identify myself strongly with that part of our recommendations. It is clear, I go on to read from the report, it is clear that to the committee that there are concerns which are required to be considered. The committee recommends that the Scottish Government give full consideration to the evidence submitted to the committee with a view to determining whether any of the issues are required to be addressed by amending the bill at stage 2 or 3. As the Minister acknowledged, and that was the end of the quote, as the Minister acknowledged, there are specific concerns about the drafting of stage 1 of the bill in relation to the definition of decrofting direction, and our committee does recommend that the Scottish Government give careful consideration to these specific issues ahead of stage 2. I do appreciate the challenges that this involves, but would hope that this is possible. As the aquaculture bill progressed, there was a lack of opportunity for robust parliamentary scrutiny of evidence from stakeholders of Scottish Government amendments, which were brought forward at stage 3. This put Scottish Labour and some other parties in a somewhat difficult position of feeling obliged to abstain at stage 3 on those amendments. This was in spite of being in agreement in principle with the amendments. Scottish Labour is clear that in this case it is even more vital for the Scottish Government amendments to be available for stage 2 if possible, and I do appreciate the pressures of time on the Minister as well, but it would be extremely helpful. The issue of retrospection has been raised by both the Minister and by our convener in this legislation, and it is very important that because there's a clear-cut group of people who have been affected since the provisions came into force in October 2011, and they must be allowed to decroft just as those owner-occupier crofters of the future must be. The committee calls for swift processing of those 44 cases put on hold, and that any not put into the system by the Crofting Commission if the bill becomes an act. And this was committed to today by the Minister, which is, again, very helpful. I also intend to make some remarks about the future, perhaps presumptuous as an outsider to the crofting counties and a newcomer to the complexities of crofting law. However, certainly as an MSP who is committed along with others across this chamber to ensuring a vibrant future for crofting, I hope that possible perceptions of an outsider, albeit a rural dweller, may be of some use. From my experience living in South Scotland, the challenges faced by my constituents and supporting them, I'm keenly aware of the difficulties that rural dwelling can bring and the isolation that can come with it. Access to work, services, education and leisure, to name but a few. The Scottish Government's website, which I referred to again, tells us crofters may benefit from conventional agricultural and environmental schemes and from EU-funded programmes. The Scottish Government provides access to specific support to the crofting counties worth around £7 million a year through such schemes as the Crofting Cattle Improvement Scheme, which enables groups of more than 2 crofters to provide good quality, high health bulls in areas where it is impractical to keep bulls and overwinter them, and where no alternative hiring exists. And Scottish Labour is clear that it is quite right that a range of support to groups of crofters and indeed individual crofters should be specifically directed at them. There are enough challenges for crofters without being unnecessarily pressurised by the complexities of crofting law. This can occur when needing to make legal changes in order, for example, to build another house for the next generation, to develop small-scale renewable energy, or to diversify in some other way. There is an obligation on us across the chamber to grapple with how best to proceed. Looking at decrofting alone, there are indeed other issues of significance, as we said in our report, which are not going to be dealt with in this bill, and the committee believes this is quite right in view of the lack of time for consultation, amongst other issues. It is important that there is an opportunity for consultation, and furthermore, amongst these, there were, for instance, the definition of what constitutes an owner-occupier crofter and issues facing multiple owners of distinct parts of the same croft. The Minister's agreement to the committee's recommendations that the Scottish Government reviews all the issues raised by the committee and that the Scottish Government identifies a time frame, as highlighted by our convener Rob Gibson, for the review and provides the committee with progress as the work is underway, is welcome. Committee discussion about how best to move forward in relation to the complexities and opaque nature, or in the words of the Minister, the sometimes impenetrable crofting law, more generally, led to our comment that consolidation would place all law in one place to make it easier to access, but not necessarily to understand. What may also be required is a codification of the law, restating the policy in revised, simplified terms, as we discussed in the committee. This is a major challenge for us all in the Parliament, particularly those of us who haven't yet experienced the complexities of crofting law, but maybe also for those who have, which we owe to the future of the crofting communities. The Committee of Inquiry on Crofting reported in 2008 and set out 5 key principles central to securing its future: maintaining and increasing the amount of land held in crofting tenure, ensuring that land in crofting tenure is put to productive use, ensuring that the housing in the crofting counties makes a full contribution to the local economy, giving more power to local people to determine their future, and indeed assisting young people and new entrants into crofting. Ensuring that crofting law is better law will help progress many of these principles, I believe, more easily, although there are many other ways in which they can also be progressed. And the challenge is that we must rise to this as parliamentarians. Thank you.
Many thanks. I will now call on Alex Ferguson. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The time available seems to be going up by the second. But, Presiding Officer, I'm eternally grateful that I'm taking part early in this debate, because I suspect that a high degree of duplication is inevitable in debating what is a narrowly focused amending bill. And I suspect that every speaker will be effectively trying to find a different way of saying essentially the same thing. And that's not a criticism, because I think it's almost impossible to do otherwise in a debate of this nature. And it probably says almost everything we need to know about crofting law that no one during the last session of Parliament spotted the anomaly that arose out of the Crofting Reform Scotland Act 2010 while that legislation was undergoing its due parliamentary scrutiny. And it was that Act which introduced the category of owner-occupier crofters into the 1993 Act. And the anomaly or unintended consequence of the legislation is that owner-occupier crofters are not permitted to apply to the Crofting Commission to decroft the croft unless the croft in question is vacant. And that sentence alone, I think, summarises quite accurately the complexity of this law. So we on these benches are certainly going to support any bill that's designed to sort this problem out, and this short-focused bill is designed to do just that and no more. And yet even that seems to have given rise to a lengthy debate and even some controversy amongst those who inhabit the strange world of crofting legislation, if the evidence received on committee is anything to go by. Eminent lawyers, as we discussed earlier, all experts in crofting law were actually unable to agree on even such an apparently simple question as to whether or not this bill is actually required to sort out this problem. Some say it is, others contend that the issue could just as easily be addressed through subordinate legislation, and I'll be totally honest, presiding officer, I don't know. And if the bill really does sort out this problem, as most agree that it will, I frankly don't really care either, because the fact is that we created a problem and we need to address it, and we commend the Minister's intention to do so quickly and effectively. But given past experience, which suggests strongly that it is virtually impossible to pass any law in crofting without giving rise to several other issues, I'm willing to bet that this bill, if passed, as I'm sure it will not be the end of the matter. Already, the crofting lawyer Brian Inkster has identified and highlighted the issue of multi-ownership of crofts, a subject I think first brought up in this chamber by my colleague Jamie McGrigor. And the number has now been identified in evidence to the committee as around 700 people. So as Brian Inkster puts it on his blog, and I quote, "There we have it." I still quote, "There are 700 owner-occupiers compared to, say, 3,500 owner-occupier crofters. Thus, due to the interpretation put on the Crofting Reform Scotland Act 2010 by the Crofting Commission, 1/6 of owner-occupiers, if for present purposes we take it that owner-occupier crofters are a subset of owner-occupiers, potentially cannot decroft their own land. Furthermore, they will still not be able to do so following the enactment of the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill, this bill that we're debating this afternoon, which as currently drafted addresses only decrofting by owner-occupier crofters and not owner-occupiers who are not owner-occupier crofters. Another example, if I may say so, of the complexity of all of this legislation. But in anyone's language, presiding officer, even the most almost incomprehensible language of crofting law, 1/6 of anything is a significant proportion. And we shouldn't take any comfort from the possibility that in trying to address this one small focused problem, as this bill seeks to do, we fail to address several others. And that, I think, really is the crux of this debate. No one questions the honest intention of this bill to essentially fix a problem that we ourselves have created, even if it is a problem that no one picked up at the time. Yet in the all too brief time that we've had to get our heads around this issue on committee, it has become very obvious that crofting law is a very sick animal indeed, one that is in urgent need of a major surgical operation, as Tavish Scott indicated in his earlier intervention, rather than simply more and more bits of sticking plaster to try to fix the wound. One day, in the not too distant future, a Scottish government is going to have to grasp this thistle, pull it out by the roots and start all over again. I'm immensely encouraged by the Minister's hint in his opening remarks that the government is going to look at doing exactly that, or at least start that process. I think all of us on the committee would welcome that. At one stage of the committee's evidence gathering, I described crofting law as being like Hydra, the mythical multi-headed serpent that grew two heads every time one was cut off. In yet another Brian Inkster blogs, as I'm sure most people know, there are many of them, he described one category of crofter as aliens. So crofting and crofting law has attracted descriptions ranging from the ancient mythology of history to the futuristic world of science fiction. Now that, presiding officer, again, I think says everything. Crofting law is a monster, created in the past, but which will exist long into the future unless it is effectively destroyed and replaced. In mythological times, it was Heracles who overcame Hydra, although he needed a bit of help from a friend. With the greatest of respect, I think that the Minister will need more than one friend if he's going to be the Heracles that condemns this particular Hydra to the mists of time. We will, of course, support this bill at stage 1, Presiding Officer. I wish I could say I was looking forward to stage 2, but I'm not entirely sure that I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to open debate, and I call firstly on Grahame Day to be followed by Rhoda Grant. A generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During one of the Rural Affairs Committee's evidence sessions on the bill, Alex Ferguson confessed to being a complete layman as regards crofting legislation. And given Mr Ferguson's experience in this Parliament and on rural matters, I'm not entirely sure quite where that leaves me. As an East Coast of Scotland resident all my days, I've had little contact with crofting and therefore coming into this process possessed minimal understanding of the legislation covering it. I had thought that sitting on the committee which was scrutinising this bill, this amending legislation, I might have developed a fairly clear understanding of what is entailed. Sadly not, indeed. The more I have learned, the more confused or perhaps more accurately bemused I have become. Thankfully, courtesy of the head shaking I witnessed around the table from MSP colleagues as we took evidence, I've been reassured that's not down to my being slow in the uptake, rather that the regime under which our crofters operate and its associated definitions are so confusing as to be almost impenetrable for anyone other than the most skilled specialist legal brains. And even then, the law is open to interpretation, it seems. If anyone doubts that this is the case, and I would draw by way of example their attention to evidence given to the committee explaining the need for the bill when it had been suggested there might not be a need for it by Derek Flynn of the Scottish Crofting Federation, who stated, and I quote, "The point is that owner-occupiers are not entitled to occupy their crofts, which can therefore be held to be vacant and they can be asked to take tenants. However, owner-occupier crofters are entitled to occupy their crofts and must intimate to the Commission the fact that they are owner-occupier crofters. Instead of there being persons who have to give notice, they are persons who give notice as owner-occupiers, as well as intimating the fact that they are owner-occupier crofters." Presiding Officer, those members of a certain age may remember the hit US comedy Soap, which, having gone through the scene-setting preamble for episodes, declared, "Confused you will be." I would suggest that might also reasonably preface crofting legislation in general, and I can acknowledge in passing that Mr Flynn did have the good grace to admit that the issue we are dealing with is somewhat complicated. As mentioned earlier, the committee heard that there was debate over whether a bill was required to address this situation, or as crofting lawyer Brian Inkster argued, the current legislation could be read as providing for owner-occupiers to decroft their land, or that secondary legislation could be enacted. But in seeking to come to a view, I was struck by the comment by Sir Crispin Agnew to the committee when he told us it is good that we are putting this right and beyond doubt. The committee concluded, as the Stage 1 report states, that unbalanced legislation is required, and given the desire to resolve this issue quickly, then a bill is the most appropriate vehicle for dealing with the current problem. That said, Sir Crispin and others have raised concerns that what we have in front of us is unnecessarily complex and overcomplicated. As the report makes clear, the committee is not legally expert and therefore cannot judge the merits of some of the concerns raised. However, if those whose role it is to interpret and advise on the law are voicing concerns over aspects of the drafting, then it is to be recommended that the Government consider these in details, just to be sure. The Minister has explained that the bill is as it is to reduce the scope for misinterpretation and disagreement and to provide consistency of language between the bill and the provisions of the 2010 Act. He told the Rural Affairs Committee this bill might not be the shortest one that we could have produced, but I hope that it gives the greatest possible clarity about the intent and therefore less room for an alternative interpretation to emerge. Now, given the circumstances which have led us to this point, that is a compelling defence. Nonetheless, I'm sure the Government has listened carefully to some of the views expressed and will consider whether there are amendments requiring to be made, certainly in terms of language. As the committee's report asks, the Government must ensure that this bill is clear and competent and does not add further complexity to an already complex body of legislation or have the potential. Absolutely.
Grateful to the member for taking intervention. I think for clarity's sake, while I've made the point that the bill is drafted in such a way as it mimics, as best as we possibly can, the provisions for tenant crofters. The important thing to mention is that in establishing the current practice of decrofting for tenants, that it is apparently working very well, comparatively well. There's a stability of policy. It's being administratively fairly easily administered, and therefore to transpose those mechanisms across to owner-occupiers hopefully will not only bring clarity but also a fairly stable process that applicants can go through.
Can I thank the Minister for that intervention? However, Sir Crispin Agnew, for one, offered some helpful advice on exact wording, for example, during the committee's evidence sessions, and it's not often that a learned QC offers advice free gratis. And on the subject of legal opinion, Presiding Officer, I cannot allow the opportunity to comment on the verdict delivered on the Stage 1 report and the committee by the said Mr Inkster in a blog on the matter to pass uncommented upon. Mr Inkster decided to mark the report strictly come dancing style, awarding marks out of 10 for aspects of it as well as the finished product. Overall, the Rural Affairs Committee were given 6 out of 10, with the explanation they could have done better. However, no doubt they could have done worse. At the risk of appearing thin-skinned, it is tempting to award Mr Inkster 2 out of 10 for humility, given that his is only an opinion, albeit an expert one. However, these are serious matters and therefore worthy of serious comment. Mr Inkster has taken issue with the committee for not recognising the significance of his fear of a possible problem concerning decrofting by owner-occupiers who are not owner-occupier crofters within this bill. However, I would point out, paragraph 121 points out that the committee that we recognise that there is an issue there to be considered, but this expedited process is not one where it should have been tackled. But far from ducking this and other matters, in paragraph 122 of the report it states the committee urges that out with this bill, the Scottish Government reviews all of the issues raised with the committee in order to determine the extent and effect of each issue, consulting widely where necessary. The committee recommends that the Scottish Government identifies a clear time frame for the review and provides the committee with progress updates on this work once it is underway. That, to me, Presiding Officer, seems the appropriate way to proceed, not rushing to legislate on something which may or may not actually be a problem, something which no doubt could be the subject of different interpretation. And I welcome the Minister's commitment in this regard today. But this bill is about tackling a specific matter and doing the right thing by owner-occupier crofters, affording them the status and decrofting rights that I'm sure everyone involved in the 2010 Act thought had actually been delivered. And it is imperative that this is done as quickly as possible, because let us not forget that the lives of 44 people and their families are, at least to some extent, on hold at the moment. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Rhoda Grant to be followed by Angus MacDonald, a generous 6 minutes. Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome this legislation, but I'm concerned about its complexity, and it's already been said that the crofting specialist lawyers have warned the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee that it's unnecessarily complex and has the ability to create unintended consequences to add to those already introduced in the 2010 Act. And I heard what the Minister said in his opening speech, but I would urge him to get round the table with those who have expressed these concerns and ensure that the amendments at stage 2 deal with those concerns. Maybe include the bill team in those discussions as well. There's no harm in testing and debating this issue just to make sure we get it right, because I think it's in all our interests to make sure it comes right. And given the short consultation, I don't think that would be remiss to do. Can I touch on some of the other anomalies in the 2010 Act that also need to be sorted out? And I understand why it's not being done in this Act, because there is an urgency here that we need to deal with this, but the other ones could just become as urgently. And it was recently brought to my attention that the new legislation makes it illegal for anyone other than the registered crofter to work their croft. The previous Crofting Scotland 1993 Act stated the crofter shall, by himself or his family, with or without hired labour, either or both cultivate his croft or put it to some other use, being a purposeful use, so that every part of the croft is either cultivated or put to such use. The 2010 Act has amended that to say a crofter must comply with each of the duties set out in subsection 2, which reads, those duties are that the crofter, A, must cultivate the croft. So it means that the crofter can no longer cultivate the croft with the help of his family or indeed with hired labour. So that is an unintended consequence. And actually it flies in the face of crofting, because crofting is very much a family activity. It also misses kind of the essence of crofting, which is normally carried out on a collective basis within a community. So if you're restricting that work just to the crofter themselves and not including family, community or indeed hired help, that creates an anomaly. And maybe it's not one that's going to be policed and not one that's going to be reported on, but there is indeed an anomaly in the law. Others have mentioned other anomalies, and I think I'm possibly quoting something very similar to what Alec Ferguson was saying. But the example of the crofter that's bought his croft continues to croft the land on which and has a home and a garden on that land. He subsequently decides to sell the house and garden but keep the croft himself. So that being the home and garden not being decrofted has changed hands. And the current owner then goes to sell on to discover that while he is the landlord of his home and garden, he has it tenanted by somebody else who is the crofter, the original owner of the home. And he cannot apply then to decroft because he is not the crofter, he is the landlord. So there are anomalies there that also need to be sorted. There was things also in the Act, I think, that were I think, in my view, and certainly in others, that were not required when using grazing committees, for example, which should be the body that organises collective working in the crofting township, actually to start policing other crofters. And I think that is a very difficult thing to deal with, and we need to look at the Act and start to unpick it. I think another missed opportunity... Yes?
Gibson.
Does the member understand that the Crofting Commission is consulting on the means whereby grazing committees shall make such a report, and that it's a very, very outline one that is required by the Crofting Commission, and that therefore it isn't a threat to people working together?
I think it really depends on what they require in that report and what the content of the report is. If you work and live in small communities, you will know that there are stresses and tensions, and that report could be used as a way of giving voice to some of those stresses and tensions, which then could ramp the whole thing up to a point where the community is no longer cohesive and working together. The other thing I think we need to look at is, when we're reviewing crofting law, is to look at the role of smallholders and tenant farmers in the crofting counties. Your status in the crofting counties really depends on a twist of fate, what your land was categorised as when the crofting laws came into force. And certainly many of the tenant farmers and smallholders in those areas are keen to have the same protections as crofting gives. I think there is a degree of unity in the Parliament today that we need to review and rewrite crofting law. But that has to be done by those who understand crofting. And too often, those who do draft legislation have no understanding of the system. They're looking in from outside. They're trying to make things better genuinely, but they only manage to make things worse. And we need to remember that the first principles are that crofting is an economic driver. It was set up to deal with the excesses of the imbalance of Scottish land ownership that we debated yesterday, and it provides the crofters with security of tenure, a home and indeed an income. And recent regulation has been introduced which actually regulate and police the crofter rather than empower them. And crofting law should offer protection and empowerment in order to create sustainable economies in our most marginal areas. The 2010 Act has also imposed costs for no good reason, and it's also imposed more barriers and hurdles. I think a simple approach, and I'm not saying this is my party's position, but certainly mine, would be to repeal the 2010 Act and then look at simplifying the previous legislation. But I would stress again that we need to involve those who understand crofting in doing this. It's no mean feat because crofting has evolved in different areas. It means different things to different communities, and therefore it's almost impossible to define in legislation. But any new legislation must enshrine security of tenure, in return for which the crofter has to work their croft. And the legislation needs to give a high level of protection, but also the flexibility to allow crofting and crofting communities to work in the way that they have evolved. Presiding officer, it's right that the legislation is coming to the Parliament, and it needs to be processed with haste because of the cost of those that have suffered this anomaly. But there are many other issues to be sorted out, and I look forward to seeing the Minister maybe bring forward an action plan on how he intends to deal with those anomalies in the future.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Angus MacDonald to be followed by Tavish Scott. 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to be contributing to today's debate. And hailing from the Isle of Lewis, you'd be forgiven for thinking I'm clued up on all things crofting. However, it's become increasingly apparent to me that very few people fully understand the complexities of crofting law, and that's something which has to be remedied in the not too distant future by simplifying current crofting law, which in a number of submissions to the committee's short evidence taking have described as a mess and a shambles, or more appropriate, as my colleague Rob Gibson called it, a burach, a good Gaelic word which describes the situation well. We have layer upon layer of legislation from the 1955 Act, 1993 Act and the 2010 Act, which have created a complex system that needn't have been complex in the first place. And while this Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill is needed, and needed quickly, there are some who have described it as yet another layer of incomprehensible extra sections and consequential amendments to an Act which was consolidated 20 years ago and which has been amended numerous times. Now, I don't agree with that assertion. However, I can understand why someone would come to that conclusion. Now, as we've heard already this afternoon, we are where we are because earlier this year a flaw in the 2010 bill was flagged up by the Crofting Commission, who stated the new legislation did not give them the power to issue a decrofting direction for owner-occupiers of crofts. A decrofting mechanism is necessary to enable both tenants and owner-occupiers to release a site for the building of a house. Otherwise, it can cause complications with securing a mortgage. However, it was flagged up that the bill removed the power to decroft an owner-occupied land. So this bill amends the Crofters Scotland Act 1993 and the Crofting Reform Act of 2010 and deals with the single purpose of providing for owner-occupiers to be able to decroft all or part of their crofts. The bill also makes retrospective provision in relation to applications that have been made by owner-occupiers to decroft, but which have been suspended, which I believe are around 50, although we've heard 44 mentioned today, with 159 decrofting directions going through before the problem was identified. During the course of this bill to date, there's been considerable talk of consolidating current crofting law, which would go some way to simplifying matters. There has also been talk of starting again with a blank sheet of paper. However, having put this to a number of crofters in general conversation, I know this has not been met with any particular enthusiasm at all. Consolidation or codification would seem to be the preferred way forward, although some in the legal profession are of the view that the 1993 Act should be deconstructed and then redrafted in a way which is simple and user-friendly. Therefore, it's imperative that the Government take steps to deal with the wider problems of the 1993 Act in order to ensure the Act is fit for purpose. There's also been conflicting views, with the original problem being flagged up by an expert in crofting law, which was subsequently questioned by a solicitor specialising in crofting law, who wrote an article in the Journal of the Law Society of Scotland, arguing that there's not a problem and that the legislation is not needed. So it's no wonder that the vast majority of people are confused. In the short timescale given to gather evidence, the RACI Committee received some evidence which suggested that a commitment should be given by the Scottish Government to introduce a bill to deal with the various other anomalies in crofting law created by the 2010 Act. It was further suggested that an Act that is a readable document and can be easily understood is essential, and a simplification of the 1993 Act should be considered by Parliament. It was further stated that the present Act is a rehash of older Acts, amendments to Acts, and does not address the true issues of modern crofting. In addition, what I believe to be another valid point was raised, that a single approach does not suit the different characteristics of the different areas, and the same criteria should not be applied to all the situations. For example, in Orkney, Caithness and Shetland, there are more owner-occupied crofts than in the Western Isles, and the characteristics of crofting are quite different. The crofts in Orkney, Caithness and Shetland are larger units, with a crofter in Orkney, for example, being able to make a living from his croft, whereas, in my view, in 9 times out of 10, a crofter on my home island of Lewis will require a second job to earn a half-decent living. So in closing, Presiding Officer, it's worth highlighting the Committee's view that it strongly recommends that the Scottish Government carefully considers any amendments which may be required to the bill at stage 2 to allow for full scrutiny and to ensure that the bill is clear and competent. We need to ensure the bill is clear and competent. Quite frankly, the last thing we need is to add further complexity to an already complex body of legislation or create further unintended consequences. Let's get this right. and look at getting the rest of the complex crofting legislation right in the not-too-distant future. And I certainly welcome the Minister's commitment today to include future crofting legislation in future legislative programmes. I'm afraid I haven't quite used up my time, which must be a first. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Tavish Scott to be followed by Dave Thompson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Mr Gibson mentioned hedges in his definition. The one that we usually used in Shetland was a piece of disputed land surrounded by legislation into which one pours money. But the same principle broadly arises. I've been very taken with a number of contributions today which have effectively characterised crofting law as a charter for lawyers. And that, I suspect, is the concern of many of us who do represent crofters across the crofting counties, that more and more of their time is now taken up to seeking legal advice, and it is actually heading to the Department Office to try and sort out the single farm payment. And that, in a sense, is, I think, the biggest challenge for this government. The Minister gave a very fair answer to questions earlier on about consolidation, or, as Mr Gibson rightly said, codification, if that turns out to be the way. But, frankly, all governments have ducked this one so far. The government I was in ducked it, and the current government haven't yet found time to do it either. And I don't know if a government at some stage will decide to take such a mammoth task on, not least of which because it's, in terms of Scotland, awfully small beer. We are only talking, as Claudia Beamish mentioned, about relatively speaking, a very small number of people. But we, legislators, impose legislation upon them, and that legislation at the moment, for the reasons that the Minister very rightly gave in terms of why we're passing this bill, is causing difficulty. It's stopping them going about their normal agricultural lives, their normal crofting lives, their way of life, as I'm sure Rob Gibson and I might very strongly reflect as well in terms of what crofting actually is. We could, yes, as Mr. Surely. Yeah.
Nigel Dawn. Sorry, Mr John, could you wait for your microphone?
Thank you. I'd like to pick up your very fair point that it isn't a huge number of people in Scotland. But can I also make the point, and I'm sure the member would agree, that it actually is the land. And land is something you can't get rid of, it doesn't go away, it's actually where you live, it's where you put your feet, and actually the law of the land is absolutely fundamental to the people who live there.
Wouldn't disagree with that assessment, although the land isn't much use if it doesn't have people on it. And my issue with all of this, even in the years I've been in this Parliament and long before, when I was an NFU member at home and a farmer at home, was all we were doing, or what successive bills had done, was just to layer, as we have heard, legislation upon legislation upon legislation. And the purpose of crofting, in my view, gets forgotten in that point. Now, in my view, the government are quite right to bring forward this. I think I made that very clear at an earlier stage. And I want to thank the Minister for dealing with it quickly. He has taken it forward as quickly as he can, given the constraints that, of course, governments do face. The only point I would disagree with Mr Ferguson on in his interesting historical run through ancient mythology was that I'm not sure someone shouldn't have picked this up in 2010. After all, that's why we do employ lawyers. I mean, this, after all, came to light, and I'm sure Mr Wheelhouse will correct me if I get this wrong, but this did come to light because the Crofting Commission's own lawyers found this hole. Now, we could have a long debate, and it would be irrelevant and pointless about how big that hole is, but they found this hole. So it did slightly beg the question as to why the Crofting Commission's lawyers at that time didn't find it during the passage of that bill. Of course.
Grateful to Mr Scott for taking a brief intervention. I hope he would accept that I didn't say it shouldn't have been found. I said that it was a measure of the complexity of the whole issue that it hadn't been found.
Tavish Scott.
Sorry, I'm still taken with your run through various features of mythology, and I was trying to remember my kind of schoolboy Greek that I kind of lost your point there, but I do take that broad point. Can I just take up 1 minute also on the wider points that other members have raised in relation to not just this bill but other issues? And I've sent most of this correspondence to the Minister, so I won't go into it in any detail, but there are significant problems in other areas, and that's why I'm grateful to Mr Gibson for his consideration that his committee may give to these, and indeed to the Minister for his earlier reply in looking at these other issues, because I can give the example of one particularly go-ahead crofting couple at home in Cunningsborough in Shetland. They run a very good agricultural business. They run a B&B. They have built self-catering accommodation. They have done all the things that we expect them to do in terms of public policy, in terms of turning a small unit into a successful and thriving unit to bring their family up on, and so on and so forth. And they now have the situation that they are seen by the Crofting Commission as a joint landlord of a vacant croft. They cannot decroft any land land without agreement. And in the email that I got from them just the other day, they point out, well, I think some justification, and this may answer Grahame Day's point about how widespread this problem is, that there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of this problem in Shetland alone, where landlords, i.e. crofting landowners, have given or sold land in respect of gardens, house sites, sheds, garage grounds, polytunnels, driveways, you name it. And in those circumstances, it does seem remarkably unfair that the system would stop them making progress in this particular case simply because of the way in which the Crofting Commission are now ruling it. And worse than that, they took it up with the Land Court and got a letter back from the Land Court just the other day, in which the very helpful clerk to the Land Court basically advised them that they as an individual or a crofting couple, couldn't really challenge they couldn't take this to the Land Court, they couldn't take this policy issue to the Land Court and challenge the Commission's policy there, but they could, for example, pursue a judicial review in the Court of Session. Well, it kind of rests the case, doesn't it? I mean, we're asking a crofting couple who are making a real go of their business, the best advice we can give them as legislators is to go to the Land Court. I really do think we to the Court of Session. I really do think we need to do a little bit better on that. So I hope the government can bring forward both some very concrete plans to deal with other anomalies that I think Rhoda Grant and others specifically mentioned, which I agree with and do believe need to be sorted. I think the importance of dealing with the reality of crofting counties is very important. Angus MacDonald made absolutely the right point about the difference across the crofting counties. And I hope the Minister will reflect that. I'm sure in his own visits around the crofting counties he's seen that. That, I think, is absolutely the key to whatever the government decide to do in the future, recognising the differences across our crofting counties. And I hope that this bill will pass quickly, but we will also quickly get on to other matters which also need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Dave Thompson to be followed by Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the progress that has been made with this essential amendment to the 2010 Crofting Act, and I'm glad that we are already at stage one. And while we must ensure that no mistakes are made, the sooner we complete the legislative process, the sooner our owner-occupiers will be able to get on with their plans for new homes and such like. Now, my constituency is home to around 3,000 of Scotland's crofts, predominantly on the west coast, Skye and the Small Isles, but also on the farmland around Dingwall, the Black Isle and in Badenoch. On Skye, crofters account for around 65% of households, so clearly crofting is an exceedingly important issue for my constituency and myself. Since the decision to halt applications for decrofting was taken in February, the only possible decision in view of the legal consequences, I might add, I have been contacted by constituents concerned about the halt and the impact it will have on their plans for building a new home and securing mortgages. This shows why it is so important that the amendment to the Crofting Reform Act 2010, this bill in front of us today, fixes this legal difficulty in a comprehensive fashion, and that the solution is in place as quickly as possible, so that all those affected can resume their applications as soon as they possibly can. In the recent statement given by the Minister on the plans for legislation, I asked what plans had been considered to allow the Crofting Commission to deal with the backlog that has built up since February. I was reassured by the Minister's answer that the Crofting Commission have been asked to progress pending applications as far as possible in the meantime, so that once we have robust legislation in place, these applications can be quickly concluded to minimise the disruption caused to crofters. One concern that was raised by my constituents was that information was not particularly forthcoming concerning how quickly the backlog will be tackled. I therefore hope and expect that the Crofting Commission will put its back into dealing with the backlog to clear it as quickly as possible, and I am sure this will be done. The Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee have stated in their report on stage one of the legislation that it is important to ensure that the legislation will apply retrospectively, and this must obviously be the case. The Scottish Crofting Federation, in an article in their in-house magazine, The Crofter, described the Scottish Government's plans to bring forward this legislation as, and I quote, the correct and only way forward. And I am pleased that we are already here at stage one. Given the disruption that is currently, this is currently causing crofters, our priority with the legislation must be to ensure it is of a high quality, avoiding the need for amendment in the near future. and to get the new legislation in place as quickly as possible. In the Rural Affairs Committee's evidence, there were a number of opinions which suggested that wider reform of the crofting legislation would be desirable. I would agree with these calls and look forward to the Government's response, as there is no doubt that crofting legislation could do with consolidation. We have the Crofters Scotland Act 1955, the Crofters Scotland Act 1961, the Law Reform Miscellaneous Provisions Scotland Act 1968, the Crofting Reform Scotland Act 1976, which gave crofters the right to purchase their crofts, supposed consolidation in 1993 through another Crofters Scotland Act, and then this Parliament having a crack with the 2007 Crofting Reform etc. Act, and then a second go in 2010 with the Crofting Reform Scotland Act, and now this one, and I've probably missed something out. And on top of that, there are many regulations and guidance as well. So this is something that has been needed, this consolidation, for some time, as Tavish Scott has said, and previous governments had ducked it. No one has been brave enough to tackle it, as Sir Humphrey may have said. Perhaps Minister Wheelhouse will be the one. Now, as well as a consolidation and simplification of the law and regulations governing crofting, there are a number of other opportunities we could take to improve life for crofters in Scotland, and particularly in Skye and Lachalsh. So please forgive me for mentioning the recent study commissioned by the Scottish Crofting Federation and funded by the Scottish Government, which concludes that a proposed Skye and Lachalsh abattoir could return a modest profit if the capital costs were funded. You might be wondering, Presiding Officer, what this has to do with the bill before us today. Well, it is to do with sheep, cattle and pigs, without which you don't really have crofting. And if that was the case, you wouldn't need this bill at all. And this abattoir will have a maximum capacity for 4,000 sheep, 200 cattle and 130 pigs per year. Sorry, yeah, that's right. With projected initial throughput of 100 cattle, 800 sheep and 130 pigs. The challenge going forward, of course, will be to try to secure the funding to cover the capital costs, and I intend to do all I can to support this proposal and hope the Minister will look at it favourably. Presiding Officer, crofting is not only an important part of the heritage and identity of the Highlands and Islands, it is also the lifeblood for somewhere in the region of 33,000 people across the country. Highlands and Islands have some of the least favourable land for cultivation, and it is vitally important that we support our crofters and ensure in return that we, as a country, always enjoy the security of producing good quality foodstuffs for our own consumption, whilst benefiting the environment at the same time. We all rely on agriculture to give us the basic ingredients that make life possible, and we must all ensure that agriculture gets the support it deserves, and I'm pleased that the Parliament will back this bill this afternoon.
Many thanks. I call on Jane Baxter to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I did not imagine when I became an MSP for Mid-Scotland and Fife that I would spend some of the first few months considering the complexities of crofting legislation. There was a lot I didn't anticipate about being an MSP, and this was certainly well down the list of possibilities. It's not exactly an issue that comes up much in conversation or when speaking to voters on the doorsteps in much of my region. I must also say that in my short time in this Parliament, I did not imagine that we would also have to spend a considerable portion of committee and parliamentary time revisiting legislation, which has only recently been passed in this chamber, but which in recent months has been unravelling. And as someone who respects and honours the role of Parliament's committees in scrutinising legislation, it has made me reflect on that process and whether you can ever be sure that you know enough about a given topic to invite the right witnesses or to ask the right questions. And I suppose the answer to that is that nothing is guaranteed, and all you can ever do is to work with the advice, information and evidence available to you at that time. And that's how we found ourselves dealing with the unintended consequences of the previous bill of this Parliament. I said that the 2010 Act unravelled, but it's probably more appropriate to say it's found itself tangled in a complex knot. This legislative knot, and how we unpick it, has been causing considerable debate among the legal opinions given to the Rural Affairs Committee during its consideration of the bill. I'm well aware that it's not uncommon for lawyers to come up with several different interpretations of the law. But it's perhaps uncommon for witnesses giving evidence to a parliamentary committee to describe the law as a mess. I'm pleased that the Rural Affairs Committee puts this point at the front of its Stage 1 report on this bill. I was also pleased during the committee's evidence-taking that it was not just me who appeared to find current crofting law opaque and confusing. Indeed, I quote from the report when it highlights the significant frustration and concern with the increasing complexities of crofting law. In 2010, when the Crofting Reform Bill was passed, I was not a member of this Parliament. Those colleagues who were here at that time may recall the debates which were had then. In going back over the history of the legislation, I came across the contribution of Peter Peacock, who made what has turned out to be an extremely prescient contribution to the Stage 3 discussion of that bill. Unfortunately, while the optimism of Peter and other members that we would not see another crofting bill for some time has proved to be too optimistic. But his closing comments are worth recalling. He said in that debate, "Future parliaments would do well to address the deep and enduring economic challenges that many people in our crofting counties face. Until those challenges are met, there is little that legislation can do other than impose more complexity, regulation, bureaucracy and cost on crofters. The bill exemplifies all those features. If it passes on to the statute book, it could be held up as a warning, not an example. And it is those deep and enduring challenges to people and crofting communities which I hope we can keep in mind as this bill moves forward." The Scottish Government responded to the Committee of Inquiry on Crofting report in 2008 by laying out the 5 key principles with which it would secure the future of crofting. These were to maintain and increase the amount of crofting land in tenure and ensure the land is productively used, the role of housing and its contribution to the local economy, encouraging new entrants into crofting, and perhaps most importantly, empowering local people to make decisions about their future and the future of their communities. These are laudable aims, and it's hard to disagree with them. Unfortunately, it seems that while the steps being taken by the Crofting Commission are attempting to move forward to achieve many of these goals, the legislation surrounding crofting is dense, and as I have previously noted, described by some witnesses in less than flattering terms. Staying with the committee's report, I hope the Scottish Government will note the committee's recommendations that it pays close attention to the concerns raised by witnesses to the committee about the current crofting legislation. Having listened to the witnesses give evidence to the committee, I would fully support the point made in the report that there should be consideration given to the possibility of not just consolidation of the legislation surrounding crofting, but making sure that crofting policy, based on the law, is stated, as the report puts it, in revised, simplified terms. The Minister will recall the concerns raised over the previous piece of legislation considered by the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee, the Aquaculture and Fisheries Bill. In particular, many members rightly highlighted their concerns about unscrutinised amendments being brought forward by the Scottish Government at Stage 3 of the bill. I therefore look forward to the Minister heeding the committee's recommendations to not just write to the committee to indicate how it will respond to the points made in the report and the debate today, but also to giving thought to what amendments should be brought forward at Stage 2 to allow thorough consideration of what is a complex and very technical area of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Richard Lyle to be followed by Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin my speech today by welcoming the introduction of this bill to this Parliament. As a member of the Rural Affairs and Climate Change Committee, I fully support this bill and the Government's swift action, as I believe it is the right thing to do. Not everyone is, however, outside of this belief. There are those who think outside this Parliament that this bill has been hurried through. To that, I ask them to think of the landlords, the crofters and the local people affected by this required change. Now is not a time for indecision, but a time for effective, proper and right legislation that helps to fix the problem that these people face. This bill should not be a party political issue, and I do sense across the chamber that we will agree this bill and at this stage and let it progress at decision time. That, I am sure we all can agree. This should be about the people who are being affected by the issue we are debating. I would like at this point to return to actually look at what crofting is, and the point that Jane Baxter made. When I was appointed to the Rural Affairs Committee, I didn't know what crofting was either, but I'm starting to learn what it means and what it means to so many. Crofting is a system of landholding which makes a significant economic, social and environmental contribution to remote rural areas. It is a part of our history. There are, I am informed, nearly 17,725 crofts in Scotland, mainly in the Highlands and Islands, and around 33,000 people live in crofting households. The reason this bill is needed is to address a problem that occurred as a result of a provision in the Crofting Reform Scotland Act 2010. I'm sure everyone's repeated this. 2010 Act introduced owner-occupier crofter into Crofters Scotland Act 1993. And I listened intently to the point made by Dave Thompson earlier about the various bills that have come in over the years in regards to crofting, and I listened to the point that Angus MacDonald made in regards to what is required and needed to be done. This, again, has been identified by the Minister and by the convener of the Rural Affairs Committee and other speakers. This has had an unintended effect, meaning that owner-occupier crofters are not allowed to apply to the Crofting Commission to decroft land unless the land is vacant. I would also like to note there have been several criticisms that this bill has been not effectively consulted on by those it would affect. The point I made earlier and would like to re-emphasise is that those who are affected by the current situation have the desire for it to be fixed by the provisions of this bill. And not only that, Presiding Officer, despite tight parliamentary time, the Government did attempt to seek views of the stakeholders regarding this matter in the time possible, and the Minister quite ably did remind us of that fact earlier on today. I also make this point merely to highlight the fact that the Government has made every attempt to involve people in the decision-making process. The only point of prominence that I would like to note is that, which has been highlighted by the strength of opinion, particularly from lawyers and crofters, and Grahame Day earlier on said that we got nearly the only free legal advice that we've had from lawyers. But the current state of the crofting law is poor, and I think everyone recognises that. And from someone who's from the Central Region, for me to recognise that, I think it must be poor. This is something which I am confident that this Scottish Government and this Minister will look at in detail. This bill is rightly a problem, is righting a problem and closing a loophole. I personally, along with the committee, believe that despite the concerns raised regarding the bill will achieve the policy aim. I believe that this bill, the way it's set out currently at stage 1, will do what it sets out to do, will enable owner-occupier crofters to apply to the Crofting Commission for a decrofting direction. My final remarks on the stage 1 debate on the bill are that as a result of this bill, the current problem and hopefully the loophole will be closed, bringing much needed assistance to those people who are affected. And finally, I'd like to once again congratulate and welcome the Scottish Government for bringing forward the bill for the swift action. I believe their action, as well as the work done by the able members of the Rural Affairs Committee, and I'll say it again, I think I said it yesterday, under the stewardship of our convener on reporting on the bill, is to be commended and highlights the commitment by this SNP Government to get things right for the people of Scotland whom we serve. Thank you.
Many thanks. I call Jean Urquhart to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too would like to commend the Minister and the Scottish Government for the manner and punctuality with which they have addressed this serious issue.
I'm sorry, could I ask whether you could move it round slightly, the microphone?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
The problems surrounding decrofting do require our most serious attention and have caused real concern among the crofting communities in my constituency. And so I would like to say thank you to the Scottish Government for acting swiftly to fix this anomaly. I'd also like to thank the RACI Committee and SPICE for their helpful reports on the bill, without which many lay men and women would struggle even more to digest the purpose and necessity of this amendment. The amendment seeks to extend the legal right to decroft to those individuals who have purchased their croft and become an owner-occupier. And I don't think that the government, or anyone else for that matter, had the intention to deny decrofting rights to the owner-occupiers with the 2010 Act. This bill keeps with the intention and purpose of previous crofting legislation by correcting a lack of legal rights which should never have been lacking to begin with, and we have noticed one of the more anomalous legal issues. And it's right that this is corrected as quickly as possible. Giving owner-occupiers via codification the legal right to decroft will retrospectively validate the 159 accepted applications to decroft by owner-occupiers, which were accepted by the Commission since 1st of October 2011. This bill grants a legal certainty to these 159 by reassuring them of the validity and legal status of their croft's current situation. It's important to bear in mind the intentions of this amendment bill are limited in scope. They seek to bring owner-occupiers back under the umbrella of normal crofting legislation by extending to them legal right to decroft, but also by requiring the same preconditions before application and giving right to the same appeal process a tenant would be entitled to with regard to decrofting application. As a member of the cross-party group on crofting, I am very aware of the legal complexities that surround crofting, like surround few other subjects I know. I note that in the Stage 1 report, the RACI Committee calls on the Government to ensure that the bill is clear and competent and does not add further complexity to an already complex body of legislation. Well, indeed. Indeed, some of those involved in crofting law believed that not only was the bill unnecessarily complex, it was unnecessary in the first place. I'm no expert on the legal detail of the bill, and while I believe that new legislation in this instance is the correct action to take, the criticism made by some of the drafting of the bill does give cause for concern. Given the nuances and peculiarities of crofting, the various legal interpretations offered during the committee's evidence gathering and the expedited nature of that evidence gathering, I trust that the Government will be responsible and listen to all views as the bill progresses. I also trust that the Government will continue to do what it can to clarify and simplify crofting law in the near future. Obviously, decrofting was a pressing issue, and I appreciate that. To tack on other issues in crofting legislation to this amendment bill would have slowed down the process considerably. I hope, however, that this experience has highlighted to many that there is a will and a need for crofting legislation to be reassessed by Parliament and for that legislation to be, as RACI say, clear, competent, consistent and fit for the 21st century, as was recommended by the committee. And I would therefore be keen to see the Government continue to consult with those in the crofting community on the possibility of bringing forward further legislation after the recess. And I hear everybody groan at the notion of further legislation, but this could consolidate and simplify existing legislation. We must pass this amendment expediently for the benefit of the crofting community, I believe. And then after recess, I also believe we can focus on the other areas of crofting legislation which need change. Minister, I know that you're recently in this post, but it seems to me that before the end of this parliamentary session, and we have 3 years, that you could make your name as the Minister who fixed the Crofting Act once and for all. I support the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Nigel Dawn.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by heeding the comments of the Minister who would like us to focus on the current bill. I will do that. And I'd like to go back to a subject that I mentioned briefly when in committee we were interrogating the officials before we spoke to the Minister, because I'm extremely concerned that we make sure we get transition on transitory provisions right. They have come back to bite us before, not I think in crofting law, but certainly in other areas. I would refer the Minister to the IO and LO versus Aberdeen City Council case. This was a family law case but it was one where the policy of the Act assumed that the transition from what was previous to what was intended would take place within a specific period of time. Unfortunately, it didn't guarantee that that would be the case. It became convenient for some lawyers to drag out their cases, and we finished up in a position where the law was simply in a complete mess because it had been assumed as a matter of policy that the transition would be completed. Now, I'm sure the Minister's officials are well aware of that. I imagine the Minister will himself be well aware of that. But if I look at Section 4.2c, at Section 4b and Section 5, which itself is actually a transitory provision, I do find dates. Now, I'm sure they've been very carefully thought about, but I do just encourage the Minister and his officials to just go and reflect, are the things that you're intending to cover there absolutely guaranteed to fall within those dates? Because if they're not, you can see the obvious implication that we may just have overspecified it, and I really wouldn't want to be there. That would be extremely unfortunate. However, at that point, I'm going to stop taking the Minister's advice and focusing on the bill before us, because actually I think everything that can reasonably be said has been said. In fact, I think Alex Ferguson got that absolutely right some considerable time ago in this debate, and I really have absolutely no desire to repeat, other than perhaps to say that I think the government has done precisely the right thing to deal with the issues as promptly as it has. And I'd like to elaborate slightly on the concerns that have already been expressed, some of them I have to say by people who know a lot more about crofting law than I'm ever going to, about the position in which we find ourselves, and comment on perhaps how we might deal with it. I'd like to start, though, just by going back. Nobody else, I think, has yet mentioned the Shucksmith report. I'm going to do so. I think it's probably a very good thing that Michael Russell is not actually with us. His hair might go even whiter very, very quickly. But I'd like to refer to, in the notes, at the corner of, the side of the page on 215, on page 15, it says, and this is an unattributable quote, "All croft land is a bequest to us from the past, and it's our duty to pass it on to the future generation and not over-exploit our inheritance for short-term gain." I suspect, so say all of us, because I don't hear anybody in land reform, and we had, of course, a considerable debate on that yesterday, saying somehow we should get rid of crofting. I don't think that's part of anybody's agenda. And then if I go back to page 8, and again in the margins, another unattributed quote, "There is a desperate need for the regulations surrounding crofting to be modified and hopefully simplified, which would encourage the advancement of crofting." And again, I think probably so say all of us. What I'd then like to do is look at the government's response at the time. And if I go to the forward, I will find, and a fairly extensive quote, if I may, Presiding Officer, "In reforming crofting, we need to focus on what crofting can contribute to the development of a successful rural Scotland. We have to recognise that circumstances in the 21st century are quite different from the circumstances of the 19th century, when the first Crofters Act was brought into force. The first Crofters Act was introduced to give tenants rights over the land they occupied, to enable them to stay in their communities. I think we're with the script all the way through this. Agriculture was a dominant feature of crofting, but as we've moved into a more competitive global market, crofting agriculture has declined and crofts have been put to wider uses." I note Dave Thompson's comments that maybe we'd get back to more agricultural uses if the appropriate facilities were there. Today, crofters exercise control over much of the land in their communities and trade their crofts and croft tenancies on the open market as demand for housing increases. And again, I think we all recognise that housing is needed. Cannot populate an area if there are not appropriate houses. The consequence of these trends is that traditional crofting practices are in decline, and more land is being taken out of crofting tenure as crofters exercise their right to buy and realise the value of these assets in the open market. Indeed.
Rhoda Grant.
That point, and I think the member makes a valid point where crofting has changed and people are using the land to do something because it is basically an economic lever and people need to lever in an income and like from the croft. And one of the problems has been that when you look at agricultural grants, if you look at CAP, if you look at all those systems for helping towards, paying towards agriculture, crofting never gets its fair share of that to meet its disadvantage. And until you actually look at the economies of crofting, it will never go back to being land-based, is my view.
Nigel Dawn.
I think the member makes a very interesting point and an enormously complicated point in what we already know is an area of enormous complexity. I cannot disagree with it that we need to sort out, if we're going to stick with crofting, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that we shouldn't, we have actually got to think about how the land law itself works, but how the economics of that works. If I might continue the quote, crofting is now at a crossroads, and we need to decide which direction to take it in to secure the future of crofting, bringing new blood into crofting communities and releasing their energies to help them secure sustainable economic growth will be key. Now, that seems to me to be crucial to anything we're going to say about how we revise crofting land law. Because in exactly the same way that yesterday's general land reform discussion was going, at the end of the day, it comes down to the economy. The land is merely where you plant yourself and you dig your, put your hoe in the ground. It's ultimately going to come down to the economic use of land, and we mustn't lose sight of that. I note that in the overview that then followed, the government set out 5 principles, which I think, again, if I might just summarise, maintaining and increasing the amount of land held in crofting tenure was number 1, ensuring that land in crofting tenure is put to productive use, ensuring that housing in crofting counties makes a full contribution to the local economy, giving more power to local people to determine their futures, and assisting young people and new entrants into crofting. In 5 lines absolutely summarises where we're going to have to try and go, I would suggest. If I might then pick up one other thought at the back of this. Government at that point, and I don't think this is a party political issue, I really don't, says at 315.1, we believe new legislation is needed to replace, simplify and clarify the accumulated laws which set the framework for crofting today. But what it then goes on to say is, the Scottish Government is sympathetic to the aims of this recommendation. However, in view of the complexity of crofting law, the process of simplification would, if properly undertaken, significantly delay the implementation of these policy proposals. Therefore, my words, not the quote, we're going to do this little bit now and we'll worry about the bit sometime. And we're still there, aren't we? And I think the point is that we're always going to be there unless the Minister is prepared to take what I think would be, in the jargon of these things, to undertake the heroic task, ministerial task, of actually trying to sort all this out. I'm grateful to other members for pointing out that there is a difference between consolidation and codification, and I think it's actually important that we get our minds around that. Consolidation is fundamentally putting the words that we've already got in the right order on one piece of paper. That might help. I suspect that's largely done by those who do these things commercially and make them available. What we probably, in fact, I'm absolutely sure what we actually need is codification. I note that Rhoda Grant suggested we should repeal the 2010 Act and then go from there. I do seriously suggest that we should repeal absolutely everything and rewrite it from the policy upwards, making sure, of course, that we have transitional terms which ensure that everything still works. But unless we can work out what the policy is really meant to be, I suspect we're just going to add one more layer. And I can't help noticing somewhere in one of these there was a reference that 315.2 to, I think, the government's response to Shuck Smith says no change should be made to those rights given to individual crofters in the 1886 Crofters Act. So we've been at it for a while. I think that's probably all been repealed, but it does again make the point, doesn't it? It's fabulously old stuff. Sorry? I missed that. Apologies.
I'm afraid you need to begin to draw
thank you. I would also just commend a couple of other thoughts. First of all, my colleague Angus MacDonald pointed out that there are different policy in different areas. And that's why I think you need to go back to the policy before you write the law, because the law will reflect the policy. Could I also pick up on the point that somebody made, and forgive me, I've now forgotten who, about things having to be sorted out in the Court of Session? I mean, that's got to be madness. If a decision has to be taken in the Court of Session, we have failed. We have failed seriously. And we must make sure that we write the law and don't expect the Court of Session to sort it out for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to the closing speeches of the debate. And I call on Jamie McGregor.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close today's Stage 1 debate for the Scottish Conservatives. And I also thank the members and clerking team for the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee for producing a thoroughly and extremely useful Stage 1 report in such a short time frame. And thanks also should go to Tom Edwards of SPICE for his excellent briefing. He never lets us down. Now, not long ago, I attended a meeting of crofting lawyers in the Signet Library, where an eminent lawyer assured the brethren there that in crofting law there will be much work for them for the foreseeable future. Now, I'm beginning to understand why he said that. Someone once memorably described crofting as being a small island surrounded by a sea of legislation. And so here we are, adding another piece of legislation to the swell of that great ocean. Although I suppose it would be fair to call this particular bill a wee burn rather than a big river. But it is a very necessary one at that. Now, like the committee, I regret that due to a lack of clarity and omissions in existing legislation as it stands, the Crofting Commission decided there was no legal basis for it to make determinations on applications by owner-occupiers, crofters to decroft. And as we have heard from other members from the Highlands and Islands today, this has caused considerable difficulties for a number of my constituents across the crofting counties. It is right, therefore, that the government determined to bring forward legislation to remedy this state of affairs as swiftly as possible, and it is also appropriate and sensible that this legislation should apply retrospectively to all those who have previously made applications or who have applications which are pending but on hold due to the legal concerns. Now, we've had consensus in the debate today that this legislation on the specific issue of decrofting is definitely required. However, I share the concerns of other members and the Rural Affairs Committee that there's a considerable body of legal opinion that this current short bill is itself too complex and might need possible amendment to avoid further difficulties in legal interpretation in the future. And I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, so like the committee, I can only urge ministers to take on board and address the concerns that have been expressed by eminent figures such as Crispin Agnew QC and Brian Inkster, and therefore, if required, ministers should amend the bill at stage 2 so that we do not find ourselves having to enact yet another amendment bill in a few months or years. We must try and avoid this at all costs. And I note also the committee's reference to the significant number of other outstanding issues relating to crofting, which many believe require to be addressed, some of which are separate from the specific decrofting issue the government is seeking to address in the current bill, and some of which are more connected with it. These include detailed concerns about what legally defines an owner-occupied crofter, and the legal position of decrofting a croft that has been divided and where there are multiple owners, an issue I did raise with the Minister in the Chamber at the end of March. Again, I would agree with the committee's recommendation that ministers should identify how they intend to address these and set out in what ways they will proceed. And like others, I welcome the minister's commitment to establish a group to look at how these issues might best be addressed. More generally, the committee's report reflects the widespread concerns that exist among crofters and their representatives about the complexity of crofting law. That's a concern I also share. It's been brought up at the cross-party group, which I convene again and again. The consolidation of crofting legislation remains a sore, and it's a constant agenda item at the request of CPG members. And each time we talk about it, and the Minister did tell me earlier this year in a written question, S4W12989, in case he wants to know which one it was, that, and I quote, "The Scottish Government will consider the consolidation of crofting legislation after it is satisfied that all the provisions of the Crofting Reform Scotland Act 2010 are working as intended." Is he able to confirm that this remains the case when the provisions of that Act, and of course what will now be the Crofting Amendment Scotland Act 2013, are working as intended? And for that matter, when will we know if they are working as intended or not? Who will make a decision on that? I can see considerable argument between different townships over what's working and what isn't. And I think that the Minister will have to look at that, because in regard to his answer, which is saying that he will do something, he may not be in a position to know what's working and what isn't. That is something. Certainly.
Tavish Scott.
I take Mr McGregor's argument there about who would have to make that call. Isn't the real danger in his analysis there that it would be lawyers again who made that call, none of the rest of us?
Jamie McGregor.
Well, I mean, as I said earlier on, there appear to be a few people with smiles on their faces, and they're not particularly the crofters, which leaves, I suppose, the lawyers. But, Presiding Officer, as I pledged to the Minister in his statement on the issue of decrofting on the 28th of March, the Scottish Conservatives will support this bill, as we recognise the need for the urgent legal clarity that will allow owner-occupier crofters to enjoy the same rights as croft tenants. And we look to the Scottish Government, working closely with crofting law experts, to ensure that everything possible is done at subsequent stages of the bill to ensure that there are no unintended consequences of this legislation. And we want ministers to address the other issues that the committee has identified, those especially that are badly in need of attention. Crofters and the crofting communities, who have so many other challenges to overcome, especially this year, with the rigours of a bad winter and the increases in the price of animal feed, deserve, at the very least, clarity from their legislators. And I think, looking back, my experience of crofters has always been a good one. Although 15 years ago, I canvassed very many crofters across the Western Isles when a candidate there, and I found that the crofters, despite whatever their politics might be, were very welcoming. I once entered, sometimes their dogs were not so welcoming. I once entered a kitchen which revealed a sort of Mary Celeste situation, with an uneaten breakfast on the table and a radio playing the news. And while I realised that the house was empty, but before I could exit, growls from the door revealed two enormous sheepdogs who wouldn't let me out until the owners arrived an hour later. Another time, I went to canvass a crofter feeding his sheep in a field, and he shouted at me that I wouldn't have his vote until I went back to Westminster and got John Major to do something about the sea eagles. Now, I know we've mentioned sea eagles a lot, but there are a lot of issues that face crofters. The point I'm making is that they are practical issues. And people, the lives that we sort of live here don't involve going out at 6 in the morning and feeding the cattle and feeding the sheep in muck and rain and wind and difficult things. And it's up to us who sit in the comfortable chairs to at least give them the legislation that they deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Claire Baker with around 10 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would like to start by thanking all those who have worked on the Stage 1 report. This has been done quickly, and I know this is a committee with a very busy work programme, and we all support their efforts to resolve the recent problems as soon as possible. The committee's Stage 1 report does highlight the challenges with taking evidence within these timescales. I think they've highlighted this afternoon the complexity of evidence they've received, and also the desire from many stakeholders to start to talk about wider issues around the 2010 Act and Crofton legislation. At the time of the statement, it was identified that there were 179 crofters who had already decrofted and 60 who were in the process of decrofting. And I welcome that we've had updated numbers around the current picture this afternoon. And at the beginning, the Minister gave examples, real-life examples and situations of people that are being impacted on this current situation, and that really emphasised the need for swift action. This situation has added to the financial pressure for these crofters, and it's good today that we are on track to provide legal clarity before the summer recess. For those who have been caught by these set of circumstances and those that may have planning permission which is running out, this is particularly important. It has been a period of uncertainty, and there has also been uncertainty at the committee, and there was, as other members have highlighted, a debate around whether or not the bill was necessary. Brian Inkster, the Crofton lawyer who's been mentioned a few times this afternoon, put forward an argument that this could be resolved in a different way, while Derek Flynn, who's the chair of the Scottish Crofton Federation, was supportive of this bill being the right way forward. But in conclusion, there was an agreement that this is the way we should proceed, and we support efforts to resolve this as quickly as possible. And through this bill, obviously subject to stage 2 scrutiny. This experience has lessons for the future, and like Jane Baxter, I also went back and looked at the stage 3 debate, and Jane Baxter has already quoted Peter Peacock, but just to repeat the kind of final line that Peter used was that if this bill passes on to the statute book, it could be held up as a warning, not an example. And I think this afternoon, members' contributions around the complexity of this bill has raised questions about how we go forward on Crofton legislation. There were concerns over the scrutiny of the 2010 Act at the time, and we, along with the Liberals, did abstain on the final vote with an expression of the concerns we had. While we recognised the government's intentions, we did have concerns about the implementation of the bill, and I'd rather that we weren't in the position of returning to the legislation so quickly. And many have made points that during the stage 1 evidence there have been a need for future greater scrutiny of the Act to guard against there is maybe a need to look at the 2010 Act in its wholeness to guard against any future flaws or unintended consequences that may come to light. There have been concerns over future unintended consequences or anomalies. I will take the intervention.
Rob Gibson.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you would agree with me, Presiding Officer, that we ask members to recognise that the 2010 Act is consequential on various other ones, particularly the 1993 Act, where the definition of owner-occupier and so on originates from. So if we're going to be looking at these, we must take into account all of the Acts, not just the 2010 one.
Claire Baker.
I do appreciate the complexity of Crofton Act, and the 2010 is dependent on previous acts. It would be good, if the government could provide more detail on their thinking on this. And during the debate, Rhoda Grant has described this as support for an action plan, and it would be good to know that the Minister is working constructively with the committee on how we move forward on the broader issues. The committee in the report did ask for a clear timetable on this, so I think we're all in recognition of the complexity, although I will say again that in particular with the 2010 Act there wasn't it wasn't a unanimous decision of the Parliament. There were parties that expressed concern about the scrutiny that was carried out during that time. In the debate, I think there's been frustration in the debate. Rhoda Grant suggested we repeal 2010. Nigel Dawn went as far as suggesting we repeal all Crofton legislation and start at the beginning. And I think that reflects the complexity and the frustration that members feel. And I think that arises out of their experience with their constituents. Tavish Scott talked about consolidation, although I think it's been recognised that bringing all the things together might not actually lead to greater simplification. So whether we look at consolidation or codification, there's certainly a need to think how do we progress on this. In terms of the stage 1 recommendations, the committee made a number of recommendations which members have highlighted. There are concerns that the bill as drafted is unnecessarily complicated, and Rob Gibson, as the convener, talked about an overly complicated bill, and there may be a need to bring amendments at stage 2 to avoid future difficulties in legal interpretation. And I do hear the Minister when he says he believes it's necessary for the bill, this level of complexity is necessary in order to apply the level of clarity that's needed, but I think there maybe is I would encourage the Minister at stage 2 to look at this in a bit more detail and work with those who are suggesting ways for simplification. The committee also highlighted the definition of decrofting direction and protecting of access to crofting land as issues that also need to be addressed at stage 2. There were significant other outstanding issues on crofting, which many members have highlighted today, and it's sometimes difficult to know how widespread these difficulties are. The definition of owner-occupier crofter, or the complexities that arise when there are multiple owners of distinctive parts of the same croft. We know that there are around 700 people potentially involved in that. And Rhoda Grant also raised further concerns with the Minister around unintended consequences over who cultivates a croft, and I would encourage the Minister to correspond with Rhoda Grant perhaps on this issue. As Rob Gibson said, that complexity of crofting law is it's difficult, and it's one that has developed over generations and over centuries. It's not just down to this one Act. But we are currently dealing with the 2010 Act, which changed the definition of a crofter, so that crofters who'd bought their crofts, which they could do since the 1976 Act, would have the same rights or conditions of occupancy as crofters who remain tenants. And as others have said, crofting law has been described as a mess, and Jamie McGregor has been around for longer than me, but it was last night that I read that a croft is often described as a small piece of land which is surrounded by legislation, which I thought was quite a good description. Also in the evidence to the committee,
Jamie McGregor.
I would just like to inform for clarification that I once gave a surgery in Portree where a crofter arrived with a bundle of papers and threw it down on the table in front of me and said, "That's the story." And I looked at the first paper at the top and it said Secretary of State for Scotland 1948.
Claire Baker.
I think that's a good example of how long we've all been involved in this. But given that Jamie was involved in politics in 1948, that maybe shows the gap, the generational gap that is between us. But Derek Flynn, in evidence to the committee, said more than a century ago, a textbook said that crofting law was more complicated than tax laws. Every time there is reform, it is always stated that crofting law is to be simplified, but every time we get another layer on top of what has already gone before. So it is intricate, complicated, historic legislation, and it feels like the proportionality of the legislation has been completely lost. The committee have asked the government how this can be addressed and asked for plans that ensure that crofting law is as clear, competent, consistent and fit for the 21st century as possible. So I think the committee have been sensible in their approach. They've had to balance the need for speed with accuracy, and they recognise the support for the pressing need to rectify the anomaly which prevents owner-occupied crofters applying to decroft, but also the need for full scrutiny at stage 2 to guard against further complexity or the potential for further unintended consequences. There has been a bit of the broadening of the debate this afternoon. Tavish Scott gave the example of a crofting couple which seemed to encapsulate that they are involved in legal complexities when actually their time and efforts would be better spent getting on with what they actually do and the success that they're able to deliver. And although today has been a focus on legislation, no legislation will solve the challenges that are being faced by crofting. The challenges facing crofting are economic, not regulatory. There are some 18,000 crofts in Scotland housing over 33,000 people, and a large part of Scotland's natural heritage and designated sites lie within the crofting counties. That is nearly 70% of land designated as national nature reserves and more than 60% of land designated as sites of special scientific interest. And last night I was at the high value farming event held by SPCB-Questions, and they were discussing how do we support crofting and more vulnerable farming. And it was interesting that they argued there needs to be a clear link to productivity. And currently CAP reform and agricultural support is actively being discussed. And when we look at in Scotland the move from historic to area payments, and we look at the changes we can make to RSDP, there are perhaps present opportunities and potential opportunities to provide greater support or to crofting communities. There were some interesting exchanges on Twitter last night. Of course, there are always interesting exchanges on Twitter, but Scott Voices is a site which highlights a different Scot every week. And this week it's been Donald McSweeney from the Western Isles, who is a crofter. And the issues that have been discussed have been around absenteeism, saying that it is now perhaps it's easier to detect and deal with. But in the Stage 3 debate for the Crofting 2010 Act, Peter Peacock made a perceptive comment on absenteeism. He said that the bill, for example, in being tougher on absenteeism and neglect, seeks a regulatory action to what is essentially an economic question. If crofting provided more of a living and there were more economic strength and diversity in our crofting areas, we would probably not need to debate absenteeism. And Dave Thompson made comments around proposals for a local abattoir, and part of it is having the modern infrastructure to support crofting communities, to make sure those communities are sustainable. Also, last night they were discussing neglect, which can be a more difficult thing to deal with. Neglect blights land that has the potential to be worked. It is damaging to crofting communities, the landscapes and biodiversity, but it's a difficult thing to try and address. How do you monitor it? How do you judge it? But it's certainly something where there maybe needs to be more greater action taken. There's also issues raised around increasing cost of crofting leases. And the comment on Twitter was that my 7-acre croft cost approximately £5,000 nearly 10 years ago. 2.5-acre croft next door for sale just now, and it's looking for £10,000 to £15,000. So it's how do we make it economically viable and also accessible to people who wish to become engaged in crofting. And as Angus MacDonald said, it is a difficult life. It's not often that people, that's their only job. They often have more than one job in order to sustain that way of life. So crofting has been and remains a critical means of retaining and sustaining populations in some of our more remote communities. There needs to be a focus on legacy building. Recently, the BBC Hebrides Islands on the Edge programme was talking about crofting. I think it was very good in bringing crofting into, people have an understanding of it, and they highlighted a local school which was learning crofting skills, which was proven very popular and a way of legacy building and linking the community to the activity. So we know the benefits that crofting can bring. It has strong communities with a collective effort to work the land and keep for future generations, but we must work together to ensure its viability. Today is an essential debate to move forward to a solution to a problem which can be solved, and it's a fairly technical one. But the bigger question is, how do we really support crofting? How do we support economic development in rural areas? We need more targeted resources on the less favoured areas, using agricultural support, rural development mechanisms and support for housing, linked to the debate we had yesterday on land reform. More joined-up rural development policy and greater decentralisation of jobs in the economy would do much more to support rural communities and crofting, and these are the real challenges that we face in going forward.
Many thanks. I'm now going to call on the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, to wind up the debate. Minister, I can be very generous with time until 5 o'clock. However, if you feel you have covered all of the points that were made in the debate and the points you have to make, then I'll simply briefly suspend the Parliament. Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll do my best to use the time to full effect, because there's been so many interesting points raised by members throughout the debate. And indeed, it has been an interesting debate, and I'm grateful to members for their contributions, and I'll respond to as many as possible of the points that have been raised. But first, may I say it's very gratifying to note that the broad agreement remains on the need to address the owner-occupier croft or decrofting issue. And I'm very grateful indeed for the constructive, positive approach that's been taken by all members in this debate today, who clearly recognise the need for action, irrespective of the detail that we'll go through in stage 2 and stage 3. I think there's a general consensus about the need for action. It's also gratifying to note there is a broad agreement that the bill will deliver the necessary changes and ensure that owner-occupier crofters are treated on an equitable basis to tenant crofters and indeed crofting landlords. I said earlier that crofting often inspires emotion and debate. Some may disagree on finer issues such as drafting, but I hope this will not stand in the way of progress today. And I'm sure that you will all agree that it's important to deliver the focused intent of this bill and to remain committed to that common aim during the remaining stages of this bill. Crofting does play a vital part in sustaining our rural communities, and too we can be thankful to our crofters for the wonderful sight and riches of the macher on our screens in the BBC's Hebrides Islands on the Edge programme that Claire Baker herself referred to. It is therefore important that those involved in crofting know exactly where they stand. This bill clarifies where owner-occupier crofters stand in relation to decrofting. It does remove the legal doubt on decrofting. A number of members have mentioned. I think the point to make there is, irrespective of the merits of the case that have been put forward by different lawyers, and indeed we've seen a number appear before the committee and indeed out with the committee who have a valid view. It's differing views. The fact there is that uncertainty and the fact that so many eminent lawyers cannot agree even on the need for the bill shows that there is a need to clarify, I think, and put to rest this issue so that crofters can get on with their day-to-day lives. I have listened with great interest to the points made by members today. It's been argued since February that it is unnecessary to provide new legislation to address this issue. That, as I say, is not our view in the Scottish Government, nor is it the view, it would appear, of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. And it has also been argued that the scope of the bill should be expanded to deal with matters other than owner-occupier decrofting, and I'll try and use the time effectively to refer to as many as I can. Other issues that I have been raised either today in debate or indeed in the course of the evidence given to the committee include, and O'Brien Inkster has provided a shorter bill. Length is, I would say though, not the only consideration. As I mentioned earlier, we need to ensure the issue is fully addressed, and the bill, in my opinion, and the government's opinion, does this. The form of drafting minimises the doubt that owner-occupiers should have similar rights to those of tenants in relation to decrofting. The point I was making earlier on in an intervention is that, to my understanding, the provisions for tenant crofters to decroft, while may not be perfect, they are working reasonably effectively, and there's a degree of clarity as to how tenant crofters can decroft. It's administratively being progressed by the Commission in good order and to my best of my knowledge. And so therefore, by replicating those procedures for owner-occupiers, well, may not be perfect, might not be the neatest legislation in the world, does give a degree of clarity that both groups of owner-occupiers and tenants will have the same rights in this respect. The bill should address multiple owners of the same croft as they cannot decroft. That's a point that's been made by many. It's a view that obviously I've listened to. There's obviously an issue relating to the definition of owner-occupier crofters, and that is currently out with the scope of the bill. But it is something that I'm sure that we can look at subsequent to the bill being passed and hopefully enacted. As I said earlier on, we would intend to engage with stakeholders and take stock, in essence, of the full range of problems. There may be an 80-20 principle at play here, where probably 20% of the issues that we can identify with existing legislation are probably causing 80% of the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis. And hopefully by prioritising, we can work out what are the issues that we do need to take forward and consider what's the best approach to dealing with those. I hear the members today mentioning issues such as codification, the need for consolidated legislation or consolidated plus to take amendments into account as well. And these are all matters that we would hope to engage with stakeholders, including the cross-party group in crofting and indeed our stakeholders such as the Crofting Federation and the Commission to see what is the most appropriate way of going forward. However, as I've made clear, the scope of the bill is deliberately narrow and focused, and that reflects the urgency of the problem. I have already committed in my opening remarks that I will give further consideration to other issues that have been raised, as I say, during the committee's consultation, and will inform Parliament if any legislative steps are to be taken. In respect of some of the specific points that were raised during the debate, Alex Ferguson raised the point of multiple owners not being able to decroft. The Commission can and do issue in terms of directing directions in respect of cross with multiple owners. Under the existing legislation, I'm sure the members are aware that unfortunately at the moment requires unanimity of those who are on that croft to act collectively as a landlord. But at least it does allow at the moment some provision for people to do croft in that situation. It may not be perfect, and it's an issue that we can obviously look at in due course. I will indeed.
Rob Gibson.
With regard to these multiple crofts, I wonder if it's possible for you to say how many people actually are in multiple croft situation and how many actually are caught by existing problems about being able to decroft. Is it the 2080 principle you were talking about?
Minister.
I thank the member for the question. I mean, I know there are varying estimates of the numbers involved. I believe there's between 3,000 to 4,000 owner-occupier crofter crofts. To pick up the point I think Alex Ferguson made earlier on, I know there have been figures bandied around of between 700 who are in multiple ownership. We believe the actual figure may be 808, so it's slightly higher than the 700 that was quoted. But we can give clarity to the committee and to members as we progress towards stage 2 exactly what numbers involved, if that would be of assistance to members. There are obviously issues like this, which again is an example of something which is out with the scope of this bill, but we do recognise the issue does need to be addressed, and I hope that's a point that's noted by members whose constituents are affected by this. The scope of the bill is deliberately tightly focused, as I said, to address a key issue, and unfortunately our view is that any deviation on something as substantive as that would not necessarily respect the expedited procedure being applied to the bill in this case, where there's clearly a consensus about addressing the existing issue with decrofting. Claudia Beamish mentioned the point in regard to decrofting direction. Is certainly happy to consider that issue in advance of stage 2, as was suggested by the member, if that would be of help. And it's a good example of where we can perhaps have ongoing dialogue. Rob Gibson and Claudia Beamish both described the bill as being unnecessarily complex. We have, as I say, considered the drafting issues closely as we can. We consider the bill as drafted does achieve its purpose, and indeed that's verified by a number of the witnesses to the committee. We are committed to drafting it as clean and accessible manner as possible and recognise the complexities in dealing with the crofting legislation, but I hope the explanation I've given today as to why the particular form of drafting is there is clear, and to try and give, as clearly as we can, a parity of treatment between tenants and owner-occupiers at this stage. Tavish Scott made a very fair point in terms of should this have been picked up in 2010. I do agree, obviously, but we are where we are. And as Alex Ferguson said, the measure of complexity involved in crofting legislation, I suppose it's a good indication as to how complex the law is. The Scottish Government has brought forward legislation to address this issue as soon as we possibly could, and I welcome the support of members across the Chamber for that approach. Certainly will, yes.
Grahame Day.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. Obviously, we are all driven here by seeking to address the problem as quickly as possible to allow these 44 crofters to move forward in their lives. Might the Minister outline what work the Commission has been doing to ensure that they are ready to hit the ground running if and when this bill is enacted, so that these 44 crofters can emerge from the limbo they are currently in?
Minister.
Indeed, I'm happy to do so. I mean, the original estimate of 50, having fallen to 44, reflects the fact that we requested the Commission do as much as it possibly could to process the applications it already had in hand, to the point short of obviously approving them. In the course of doing that, the Commission has identified that 6 did not actually fit the description of owner-occupier decrofting applications, and they're being processed under a different stream now. So that is a reflection of it. It means that there are applications at various stages of development. Some will be able to go forward almost immediately upon the Act being passed. Others may take up to 8 weeks once the Royal Assent is received. So I would hope that over the summer that we would have the whole backlog cleared. There are further 31 applications that have been made and returned to the applicants at this stage, and indeed we would hope they would be able to start very quickly once Royal Assent is received. And I hope that clarifies the matter for the member. Tavish Scott mentioned a couple in Shetland. I'm sorry to hear of the difficulties they are facing in the Land Court, and indicated they can't appeal against the policy of the Commission. We obviously don't have all the facts of that particular case, so I can't comment too much on it, because it is a live case. But I just will highlight basically the 1993 Act contains a wide range of appeal opportunities. It may well be some may apply in their case. Rhoda Grant mentioned that crofters cannot cultivate crofts with families as a result of duty on crofters in the 2010 Act. There's nothing in theory to prevent a crofter's family assisting the crofter by working the croft, but a crofter must be responsible for ensuring the duty to cultivate the croft is actually met. So I would hope there may be more scope there than perhaps the member indicates, but if she's willing to write to me about the particular case, I can always undertake to have a look at that. It is also open to a crofter to apply to the Commission to sublet a croft, and since 2011 it's also been open to an owner-occupier to apply to the Commission for short-term let if the croft up to 10 years. Nigel Dawn very fairly raised the point about the transitory provisions in the bill, and I can reassure Nigel Dawn that full consideration has been given to the effect of the transitory provisions in the bill when developing this proposed legislation. We will continue to consider any points as they arise during the process of this bill, but I take on board in full the concern he raised and make sure that I take personal view on that. Jamie McGregor commented that further amendments may be required in the bill, in particular reference to Sir Crispin Agnew and Brian Inkster's comments. We are aware of the drafting concerns, but I hope in addressing the points raised earlier on about the particular form of the drafting, we have picked a form which replicates the provision for tenant crofters, and therefore we believe they are relatively stable and they do appear to work in terms of processing applications. We can't guarantee there will not be a problem, but in seeking to do it this way, we hope we've minimised the risk of a problem arising in relation to owner-occupier crofters. But I will, of course, consider any comments he has in detail of that.
Minister, can I stop you for a moment? There's an awful lot of chattering going on in the chamber. Could we have some order, please, for the Minister making his final speech of this debate? Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will indeed.
Jamie McGregor.
Just on that point, the point I mentioned was that the provision for bringing forward a consolidation of Crofting Act had in it the fact that you wanted to see everything working as intended. How are you going to know when everything is working as intended?
Minister.
Well, certainly we have taken the approach to try and, in the first place, minimise the risk by taking something that's relatively well understood in relation to tenant crofters. But I will, of course, keep under review any problems, particularly in relation to speculation. I think I mentioned earlier on, we don't anticipate any additional problems in relation to owner-occupiers using this legislation for speculative purposes, any more so than there would be with tenant crofters. But we will, of course, keep that matter under review. I just want to pick up one brief point before I have my closing remarks. Claire Baker, Angus MacDonald made some very good points around, and indeed Dave Thompson around the infrastructure issues, and indeed I think it was noted by Tavish Scott as well in referring to Angus MacDonald's point. There are clear differences between the crofting counties and sometimes within the crofting counties, and I will certainly bear that in mind in terms of my tenure as Minister in respect of crofting. There was a good point made about cap reform, and I think it's clear that not only Pillar 1 but and indeed Pillar 2 are very important streams of funding for our crofting communities, and clearly we are, as a government, making the strongest possible case for a fairer allocation of funding, both within Europe and within the UK at this time. Conscious of time, Presiding Officer, I've already committed in my opening remarks that I will give further consideration, as I've said, to some of the points that have been raised today and indeed by the committee. We must consider, though, if there are further as yet unidentified issues that need to be resolved and what options are available for addressing these. I will arrange for my officials to take that work forward. I would once again like to thank the committee for the work they have put in during stage 1 to inform this debate. The technicalities of crofting are never straightforward, it would appear, and I know that a number of committee members have been taken aback at its complexity. I would add my name to that in terms of a new crofting minister. I'd also like to thank our stakeholders who have contributed so positively to this process, and I say again, I have listened to comments made today, reflecting these before stage 2, but I remain convinced that this bill will deliver what is intended. I have no doubt that we all want this issue to be addressed effectively and as quickly as possible, and I therefore invite members to support me in agreeing to the principles of the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill so we can keep on track and move to detailed consideration at stage 2 next week. Thank you.
Many thanks, Minister. That concludes the debate on the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill, and it is now time to move to the next item of business, which is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6889 on substitution on committee.
Formally moved.
Many thanks. The question on that motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come, and there are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 6798 in the name of Paul Wheelhouse on the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. And the next question is that motion 6889 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on substitution on committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.